What if the story of human civilization began not with pyramids or philosophers, but with a simple irrigation canal carved into dry earth? Long before Rome, before Athens, even before the pharaohs, there was Mesopotamia, a region nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where people first built cities, invented writing, codified laws, and imagined gods who shaped the fate of kings. For over 3,000 years, this land, modern-day Iraq and parts of Syria, Turkey, and Iran, was home to empires that rose and fell, languages that evolved and vanished, and ideas that still shape how we live today. This is the full story of ancient Mesopotamia, from the first settled villages to the last Babylonian kings. It is a story of invention, conflict, adaptation, and legacy. It is the story of how human society, as we know it, began. We'll follow the civilizations of Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon. We'll explore their cities and beliefs, their triumphs and collapses, and the innovations that echo across history. This is not just a history of the ancient Middle East. It is a history of the world's first experiments in being human together, how we governed, worshipped, recorded, built, fought, and imagined a future. Let us begin where history itself began. Long before the idea of countries or kingdoms, even before the invention of writing or the wheel, human beings in the region we now call Mesopotamia began to shape the course of history in a way that would never be reversed. This region, whose name means land between the rivers, lies between the Tigris and Euphrates, two great waterways that flow from the highlands of modern Turkey down through Syria and Iraq before emptying into the Persian Gulf. It was here, around the 6th millennium BCE, that human beings made a profound shift. From a mobile life of hunting and gathering to settled life based on agriculture and permanent communities. The shift was not sudden. For thousands of years before the emergence of civilization, small communities in the Fertile Crescent were experimenting with planting crops and domesticating animals. These early Neolithic settlements, dating as far back as 8,000 years BCE, laid the groundwork for what would eventually become organized societies. But it was the unique geography of southern Mesopotamia that provided the conditions for something much more complex to develop. Southern Mesopotamia receives little rainfall. Unlike the more temperate north, this region was dry and flat with few natural resources. On the surface, it would seem like a difficult place to live. But the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers had a secret. When these rivers flooded, they left behind fertile silt. This meant that with the right tools and planning, the land could support large-scale agriculture. Human ingenuity turned this challenge into an opportunity. Beginning around 5000 BCE, people in southern Mesopotamia began building irrigation systems, ditches and canals that brought water from the rivers to their fields. This allowed them to grow barley, wheat, legumes, and dates in large quantities. Surpluses followed, and with surplus food came new possibilities. Communities could now support people who did not farm, such as craftsmen, priests, and administrators. Labor could be divided. Trade could flourish. Leadership could form. In short, society could grow. One of the earliest known cultures to take root in this environment was the Ubaid culture, named after the site of Al-Ubaid near modern-day Ur in southern Iraq. Around 5000 BCE, the Ubaid people built large villages with mud brick houses, community temples, and storage facilities. They developed pottery, tools, and religious practices that would influence later civilizations. Their settlements suggest social organization and shared religious life, but they did not yet resemble cities. That began to change by around 4000 BCE, during a period known as the Uruk period, named after the city of Uruk, which would soon become one of the most important urban centers in world history. This period marks a turning point. It is here, in the heart of Mesopotamia, that humanity's first true cities emerged. What made a city different from a village was not just its size, but its complexity. Cities like Uruk were home to thousands of people, perhaps as many as 40 to 50,000 at their height, and supported dense populations through organized systems of labor, governance, and resource management. They had temples dedicated to patron gods, often raised on platforms called ziggurats. They had specialized workers, potters, weavers, metalworkers, and traders. They had administrators who kept records on clay tablets. These were not merely places to live. They were centers of culture, politics, and religion. The rise of these early cities did not happen in isolation. The population growth and economic changes of the Uruk period led to increasing contact between different regions of Mesopotamia. Trade networks expanded, reaching into the mountains for timber and minerals, and southward for stone and luxury goods. With trade came cultural exchange and competition. As city-states developed, they began to compete for control of land and water, two critical resources in the region. This competition helped shape a new form of leadership. In earlier village societies, religious figures likely held the most authority, managing food stores and leading rituals. But in the cities of southern Mesopotamia, a new class of rulers emerged, secular leaders who could organize labor for irrigation, defend the city, and manage disputes. These leaders would eventually become kings, though in the early stages, they may have ruled more as temporary generals or caretakers. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing levels of fortification, suggesting that warfare or at least inter-city conflict became more common. Cities built walls, not just to keep invaders out, but to mark their territory and power. These developments show how early Mesopotamian civilization began to transition from cooperation to competition, from simple villages to rival city-states. Religion remained central to daily life, however. Each city had its own patron deity, often linked to natural forces. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, was worshipped in Uruk. Enki, god of water and wisdom, was revered in Eridu. These deities were believed to reside in temples at the heart of each city, where priests and priestesses managed rituals and offerings. Temples were not only religious centers, but also economic hubs, owning land and coordinating agricultural production. The structure of Mesopotamian society began to take clearer shape. At the top were rulers and priests, followed by landowners and wealthy merchants. Below them were artisans and laborers, and at the bottom were slaves, often prisoners of war or people in debt. This stratification of society was new in human history, and it reflected the growing complexity of managing urban life. By around 3500 BCE, Mesopotamia was dotted with powerful city-states, each with its own government, religious institutions, and economic life. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, and Nippur began to compete for dominance. These were not empires, they were independent, often clashing over resources or influence. But together they formed the first sustained civilization in human history. One key innovation of this time deserves special mention: the invention of writing. Though we will explore it in more detail in the next section, it is important to note that the needs of urban life, especially record-keeping for trade, taxes, and temple offerings, led to the creation of early written symbols. These marks on clay tablets would evolve into cuneiform, one of the world's first writing systems. The birth of Mesopotamia was not a single event, but a series of gradual shifts, ecological, social, and political, that transformed the human experience. Here in the land between the rivers, people found a way to tame an unpredictable environment and build something new: civilization. They laid the foundations for everything that would follow: law, literature, mathematics, empire, and organized religion. But while early Mesopotamia laid the groundwork, it was in one city above all, Uruk, where the idea of the city truly came to life. That is where our story heads next. By the early 4th millennium BCE, Mesopotamia was no longer a collection of scattered villages. it had transformed into a landscape of independent, thriving city-states. Chief among these was Uruk, a city whose development would serve as a blueprint for what we now recognize as civilization. But Uruk was not alone. Other powerful cities such as Ur, Lagash, Eridu, and Nippur began to define the Sumerian world, a region in southern Mesopotamia where culture, politics, and technology began to flourish on a scale previously unseen in human history. This new Sumerian world was made up of independent city-states, each with its own government, military, economy, and religious center. These were not parts of a single country or empire. Rather, they were politically autonomous cities often surrounded by farmland, outlying villages, and sometimes competing rivals. Despite their independence, the Sumerian city-states shared a common language, similar religious beliefs, and many aspects of artistic and architectural style. Uruk stands out as the earliest and perhaps the most influential of these cities. By the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, Uruk had become a sprawling urban center, perhaps the largest city in the world at the time. It was a place of monumental architecture, complex bureaucracy, and technological innovation. The famous Eanna district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna and the Anu ziggurat, built in honor of the sky god Anu, towered over the city's dense neighborhoods and marketplaces. The political leadership in these cities was beginning to shift. While early communities may have been led by religious authorities or elders, Sumerian cities by this period were ruled by a figure called the Lugal, meaning big man or king. These rulers were not merely warriors, but also administrators and judges. They organized labor for large-scale building projects, directed agricultural production, maintained canals and irrigation systems, and commanded armies when conflict arose with neighboring cities. Each city's identity was tied to its patron deity. Uruk, for instance, worshipped Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, and war. The city of Nippur became the spiritual heart of Sumer, due to its temple dedicated to Enlil, a chief deity of the Sumerian pantheon. The connection between ruler and deity was central to Sumerian politics. Kings claimed to rule with divine favor, and temples served as both religious and economic hubs. In many ways, the temple was the city's engine. It owned vast tracts of land, employed large numbers of workers, and played a central role in redistributing food and goods. As urban populations grew, Sumerians developed systems to manage their complex societies. One of the most important innovations of this era was the refinement of writing. Although the first symbols had emerged in earlier centuries, it was during the rise of the Sumerian city-states that writing began to evolve into a more structured and versatile system. Scribes, working primarily with clay tablets and styluses made of reed, developed a script known as cuneiform. At first, it was used mostly for economic transactions, tracking grain, livestock, or temple inventories. But over time, it expanded to include legal codes, hymns, administrative documents, and eventually, literature. The growth of writing had profound implications. It allowed for the preservation of agreements, the recording of laws, and the coordination of labor on a massive scale. In effect, it made governance more efficient and trade more reliable. Cuneiform became not only a tool for administrators, but also a source of prestige for scribes and officials who mastered its complexities. Alongside writing came other innovations. The Sumerians developed a sexagesimal numerical system based on the number 60, which is still the basis for our measurement of time today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. They built wheeled carts for transportation and potter's wheels for production. They made advances in metallurgy, crafting tools and weapons from bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Their understanding of irrigation engineering allowed them to control floodwaters and sustain agriculture even in dry seasons. Perhaps most importantly, the Sumerians established formal legal systems and governing institutions. Councils of elders, temple administrators, and royal courts helped resolve disputes, enforce laws, and regulate the economy. While full codified law would not emerge until later, the foundations of legal culture were already present. Written contracts, debt arrangements, and records of court cases suggest that Sumerian society valued order, fairness, and accountability. Culturally, the Sumerians left an extraordinary legacy. Their myths and religious texts offer some of the earliest insights into human efforts to understand the divine and explain the world. Gods were believed to be deeply involved in every aspect of life, from the fertility of the soil to the outcome of battles. Stories such as the myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld or the Enuma Elish creation account would later influence other ancient religions across the Near East. In the arts, Sumerian sculpture and reliefs depicted not only deities but also scenes of everyday life: workers at the plow, merchants trading goods, or worshippers offering gifts at temples. Cylinder seals, small carved stone devices rolled onto wet clay, were used to sign documents and express identity. Their detailed designs reveal a society rich in symbolism and artistic expression. Trade was vital to Sumerian success. Though the region lacked many natural resources such as timber, stone, and metals, the Sumerians established long-distance trade networks to acquire what they needed. They traded with peoples in the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian Plateau, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. In exchange for grain, textiles, and pottery, they received wood, copper, tin, and precious stones. These connections helped spread Sumerian influence and facilitated cultural exchange across the wider region. However, as the cities grew in wealth and power, so too did their rivalries. Competition over water, land, and trade routes often led to conflict. The flat terrain of southern Mesopotamia offered little natural protection, and city-states began to build walls and maintain standing armies. Warfare became a common feature of life. Victory in battle could mean access to valuable farmland, control of trade routes, or influence over religious centers. The desire for dominance sometimes pushed rulers to seek hegemony over other cities. One of the earliest known examples was the ruler of the city of Umma waging war against neighboring Lagash over a disputed border. A famous stele, or carved stone monument from Lagash, depicts their king Eannatum leading troops into battle and trampling enemies underfoot, a clear symbol of military authority. Still, despite their rivalries, the Sumerian cities shared enough in language, religious belief, and culture to be seen as part of a single civilizational sphere. Together, they created the foundations of Mesopotamian life: city planning, religious ritual, record-keeping, formal leadership, and complex economies. The Sumerians also developed a keen awareness of time and history. They recorded reigns of kings, temple offerings, and celestial movements. They understood seasonal cycles and celestial patterns, using them to guide agriculture and ritual life. Their legacy would not end with their political independence. Even when later powers conquered Sumer, they continued to borrow heavily from Sumerian traditions. By around 2700 BCE, the Sumerian world had matured into a network of powerful, interconnected cities. Each was a center of political ambition, economic activity, and religious devotion. But unity remained elusive. The idea of empire, of one ruler bringing all of Sumer under a single banner, was still a dream. That dream would soon be realized, however, by a man from outside the Sumerian heartland. A man named Sargon, who would forever alter the political map of Mesopotamia. At the heart of early Mesopotamian civilization stood Uruk, a city unlike any that had come before it. Located in southern Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq, Uruk represents a major turning point in the human story. It is widely regarded as the world's first true city, not only in terms of population, but in terms of complexity, governance, innovation, and influence. Uruk was more than a settlement, it was an engine of civilization. By around 3500 BCE, Uruk had grown into a sprawling metropolis. Archaeologists estimate that at its peak, during the late 4th millennium BCE, the city may have housed between 40,000 and 50,000 inhabitants, an extraordinary number for the ancient world. Its influence, however, extended far beyond its walls. The patterns of social, political, and religious life that emerged in Uruk would spread across Mesopotamia and shape future civilizations. Uruk's urban design revealed careful planning and social coordination. At its center were two major temple complexes, the Inanna district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, and the Anu district, named after the sky god Anu. These temples were more than places of worship. They were administrative, economic, and political hubs. They oversaw agricultural production, stored grain, employed workers, and maintained records. Their construction, involving massive mud brick platforms and early versions of the ziggurat, required the coordination of thousands of laborers, artisans, and supervisors. The city was divided into residential and commercial zones, and evidence of workshops, markets, and kilns indicates a thriving urban economy. Craftsmen produced fine pottery, textiles, and metal tools. Traders moved goods into and out of the city, linking Uruk to a growing network of exchange that stretched across the region. From the Persian Gulf to the Zagros Mountains, goods and ideas flowed in and out of Uruk's gates. One of the most significant features of Uruk's development was its system of centralized administration. Managing a population of tens of thousands, coordinating food production, organizing labor, and controlling trade all required more than tradition and oral agreements. This pressure led to a series of transformative innovations, including the full development of cuneiform writing. The earliest tablets found in Uruk date to around 3200 BCE. These were not literary compositions or religious hymns. They were records, inventories, lists, and accounts inscribed in wet clay using a reed stylus. The symbols were pictographic at first, gradually becoming more abstract and stylized. Over time, they evolved into a script known today as cuneiform, named for the wedge-shaped impressions the stylus left in the clay. This system would become the standard for Mesopotamian writing for over 3,000 years. Writing allowed the city's administrators to record transactions, issue commands, organize workers, and maintain control across space and time. It was, in essence, a technology of power, one that helped turn a city into a civilization. The rise of a trained class of scribes, often working within the temple, marked the beginning of written bureaucracy. These scribes, though anonymous to us today, were among the most influential figures in early history. Another innovation closely tied to Uruk was the development of seals, particularly cylinder seals. These were small cylindrical objects engraved with intricate images and rolled over wet clay to leave an impression. Used to mark property, seal documents, and signify identity, cylinder seals offer a visual window into the beliefs, professions, and symbols of the time. The scenes depicted on these seals included religious rituals, mythological creatures, and even depictions of laborers and rulers, providing clues to the culture and values of early urban life. Uruk was also significant for its early political organization. Although the city was heavily influenced by temple authorities and priestly officials, there is evidence that secular rulers began to assert greater control over time. The title Lugal, or big man, emerged to describe these leaders, who were likely chosen during times of crisis or warfare but eventually became permanent rulers. These kings combined religious authority with military leadership, offering protection and stability while claiming divine favor. The most famous figure associated with Uruk is a man whose historical reality remains debated but whose legendary status is firmly established: Gilgamesh. According to the Sumerian king list, a document that attempts to record the reigns of ancient Mesopotamian kings, Gilgamesh ruled Uruk sometime in the 3rd millennium BCE. While archaeological evidence for his existence is limited, his presence in myth and literature is enormous. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed many centuries after his supposed reign, casts him as a heroic yet flawed ruler, part divine, part human, who seeks eternal life and wrestles with the limits of power and mortality. While the full epic was not compiled until the 2nd millennium BCE, its roots lie in the earlier myths and oral traditions of Sumer. Gilgamesh, whether historical or symbolic, embodies the grandeur and contradictions of Uruk itself, powerful, ambitious, deeply human, and conscious of the gods. As Uruk expanded its influence, the city left its mark on surrounding regions. Archaeological sites across Mesopotamia and beyond show evidence of what scholars call the Uruk expansion. This included the spread of architectural styles, administrative practices, pottery designs, and even writing techniques. Whether this expansion was driven by trade, colonization, or imitation is still debated, but the result is clear. Uruk set the cultural tone for much of early Mesopotamia, yet with greatness came challenges. The sheer size and complexity of Uruk made it vulnerable to internal tension and external threats. Managing irrigation canals, defending trade routes, and sustaining food supplies required constant coordination. And as other city-states in Sumer began to grow, Uruk's dominance would not go unchallenged. The rise of rival cities like Lagash, Ur, and Kish brought new dynamics to the political landscape. Warfare between city-states became more frequent, and shifting alliances reshaped the balance of power in southern Mesopotamia. Even as Uruk remained culturally influential, it would eventually lose its political primacy to other centers. Nonetheless, Uruk's legacy endured. It had shown what was possible: a city that could house tens of thousands, govern with written records, build monuments that reached the sky, and give rise to stories that would echo through millennia. Uruk demonstrated that cities could be more than places to live. They could be engines of imagination, memory, and power. As Mesopotamia moved into the early 3rd millennium BCE, the urban world expanded. City-states grew more competitive, leadership structures hardened, and technological advances continued. In this landscape of rivalry and ambition, a new force was about to rise, not from within Sumer, but from the northern region of Akkad. Led by a charismatic and ruthless figure named Sargon, the next chapter in Mesopotamian history would see the birth of empire. As the cities of Mesopotamia grew in complexity, with layered administrations, vibrant economies, and expanding trade, the need for reliable, consistent communication became increasingly urgent. Oral traditions, though deeply rooted in early human cultures, had their limits. Spoken words fade. Memory is fallible. And in societies where grain needed to be counted, workers paid, and debts recorded, a more durable method of communication was essential. Out of this practical necessity, one of the most transformative inventions in human history was born: writing. Writing did not begin as a means of storytelling or philosophical expression. It began with numbers and lists. Around 3400 BCE, in the city of Uruk, officials began recording transactions on clay tablets. These early texts, often no more than a few symbols, tracked quantities of grain, livestock, oil, and textiles. They marked payments to workers or deliveries to temples. The symbols were pressed into soft clay using a sharpened reed stylus, then left to dry and harden. This medium, simple, durable, and abundant, helped preserve records that can still be read over 5,000 years later. At first, the signs were pictographic, meaning they resembled the items they represented. A drawing of a jar meant a jar. A head meant a person. But as the number of signs increased and the range of ideas expanded, these pictographs became more abstract. Over time, scribes simplified and standardized the symbols. The result was a script now known as cuneiform, from the Latin word cunus, meaning wedge, a reference to the wedge-shaped impressions left by the stylus. Cuneiform was not an alphabet, nor even a true syllabary at first. Instead, it was a mixed system of logograms, symbols representing words, and phonetic signs, symbols representing sounds. It was flexible, complex, and required significant training to master. As a result, writing became the domain of a specialized class: the scribes. These individuals, often educated in temple schools known as tablet houses, were among the most literate and powerful figures in early Mesopotamian society. To become a scribe was no easy task. It involved years of instruction in memorizing hundreds of signs, mastering mathematical tables, and learning administrative procedures. Most scribes were men, though rare evidence suggests that some women also received training in literacy, particularly in elite or temple settings. A scribe's ability to read and write cuneiform gave them access to positions in government, religion, trade, and education. The earliest writing was utilitarian, but very quickly its potential expanded. Within a few centuries of its invention, cuneiform was used not only to count barley and record taxes, but also to preserve hymns, prayers, myths, and even personal letters. One of the most remarkable shifts in human history occurred as writing moved from the ledger to the tablet of poetry. It gave permanence to ideas, enabled the spread of knowledge, and allowed people to reflect on the past in a way oral cultures could not. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, writing had become central to Mesopotamian life. Every major institution, temples, palaces, merchant guilds, relied on it. Tablets recorded legal agreements, boundary disputes, court decisions, and treaties. Contracts were signed with the impression of cylinder seals, and sometimes multiple witnesses were named. These texts, inscribed in clay and stored in archives, became the first formal records of law and bureaucracy. One of the key innovations that writing enabled was the formalization of property ownership and inheritance. Tablets have been found detailing land sales, dowries, and loan agreements. These records helped stabilize economic life by providing clear, lasting evidence of commitments. In this way, writing played a critical role in supporting social order and trust in a growing and increasingly impersonal urban environment. Cuneiform also had an international reach. Though it began as a Sumerian invention, the script was soon adapted to write other languages, including Akkadian, the language spoken further north in Mesopotamia. This adaptability made cuneiform the common written language of diplomacy and administration across much of the ancient Near East for over 2,000 years. It was used from Anatolia to Persia, from Syria to Egypt, in courts, archives, and temples. The written word also shaped religious and mythological traditions. Sumerian priests and scholars used cuneiform to record prayers, rituals, and cosmological texts. Some of the earliest surviving religious hymns and incantations were composed in Sumerian, a language that would eventually become a sacred or literary tongue, even after it was no longer spoken in daily life. Among the most extraordinary results of this literary tradition was the eventual composition of epic narratives. These long poems, often drawing on earlier oral traditions, explored themes of kingship, mortality, divine justice, and the human condition. While many of these texts were written down centuries after the invention of writing, they would not have been possible without the early scribal tradition that began in cities like Uruk. One particularly notable figure in this tradition was Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who lived in the 23rd century BCE. She is the earliest known author in human history whose name is attached to her writings. As high priestess of the moon god Nana in Ur, she composed hymns and religious poetry that would be preserved and copied for centuries. Enheduanna represents a significant step in the evolution of writing, not only as a tool of administration, but as a means of personal and artistic expression. Despite the complexities of the script, writing continued to spread. Scribes played an essential role in maintaining royal authority, temple function, and economic stability. Their work helped define Mesopotamian civilization, and yet, literacy remained limited to a small segment of the population. Most people in Sumerian society were illiterate, relying on scribes to manage records and convey information. Tablets from this era also show signs of humor, disagreement, and human error. There are corrections, practice exercises, even complaints. In one tablet, a teacher scolds a student for poor handwriting. In another, a merchant argues over payment terms. These fragments offer a glimpse into everyday life and remind us that writing, for all its historical importance, was also a deeply human activity. By standardizing symbols, preserving agreements, and transmitting stories across generations, cuneiform changed how people related to time, memory, and authority. No longer dependent on human memory, information could now be stored, retrieved, and passed on with precision. This marked the beginning of recorded history. As the Sumerians continued to refine writing, other cultures observed and learned. The influence of Sumerian scribal methods would extend far beyond their own cities, as later powers in Mesopotamia adopted and adapted the system to their own needs. Cuneiform writing would remain in use across Mesopotamia for more than 3,000 years, a remarkable lifespan for any form of communication. It would evolve, specialize, and eventually fade, but its legacy remains foundational. It opened the door to literature, science, law, and historical consciousness. With writing firmly established, Mesopotamian society was prepared for the next stage of development, the rise of empire. The fragmented city-states of Sumer had created the cultural and technological framework, but they lacked unity. That would change with the emergence of a charismatic leader from the north. In the next section, we turn to the life and legacy of Sargon of Akkad, the man who would build the world's first empire. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, the city-states of Sumer had matured into powerful centers of politics, religion, and trade. Urban life had brought increased social complexity, technological progress, and widespread use of writing. But as these cities competed for influence and territory, a new idea began to take root, an idea that would reshape the nature of power across Mesopotamia. That idea was kingship, the belief that a single individual could rule not just by strength or custom, but by divine authority. Early Sumerian rulers were not always kings in the later sense of the word. In the earliest phases of Sumerian society, authority often rested in the hands of temple officials, religious elders, or assemblies of prominent citizens. Leadership may have been more communal, even rotational. But as city-states grew and rivalries intensified, a need emerged for more centralized and decisive leadership, particularly in times of war. Out of this environment, the title of Lugal came to prominence. Literally translated as big man, the Lugal was a ruler who held both military and administrative authority. Over time, this role became institutionalized, with power passing from father to son, and kingship became a permanent feature of Sumerian political life. Yet it was not enough for a king to claim power through force alone. To be accepted, his rule had to be framed in religious terms. This gave rise to the concept of divine kingship, the belief that the gods not only approved of a king's rule but actively chose him. In Sumer, each city had its own patron deity, and the king was seen as that god's earthly representative. He ruled not in his own name, but as the servant of the gods, charged with maintaining justice, order, and ritual observance. In this framework, kingship was not a purely secular position. The king led military campaigns, yes, but he also built temples, organized festivals, offered sacrifices, and enforced religious laws. A good king was one who maintained the divine principles or decrees that structured the universe. If the king ruled justly and honored the gods, the city would flourish. If he failed, disaster, flood, famine, or foreign invasion might follow. One of the earliest and most detailed expressions of divine kingship can be found in the figure of Lugal-Sagezi, a ruler of the city of Umma in the late 3rd millennium BCE. After years of conflict with the neighboring city of Lagash, Lugal-Sagezi eventually conquered it and declared himself ruler of all Sumer. He claimed to have been chosen by the gods to unify the land, and his inscriptions frame his victories as the fulfillment of divine will. In one surviving text, he boasts that the god Enlil granted him kingship from the sea to the mountains, implying control over the entire Mesopotamian plain. Temples played a central role in legitimizing and maintaining this divine authority. Monumental temples, or ziggurats, rose above the cities, massive stepped structures made of mud brick, with a shrine at the top dedicated to the city's deity. These were not just religious buildings. They were symbols of power, expressions of wealth, and centers of economic activity. The temple owned land, collected tribute, and employed large numbers of people. In many ways, it was the economic engine of the city. The connection between king and temple was mutually reinforcing. Kings sponsored construction projects, repaired sanctuaries, and endowed religious institutions. In return, priests performed rituals that affirmed the king's legitimacy and ensured divine favor. This partnership helped stabilize the city-state and maintain a balance between secular and sacred authority. One of the key rituals performed by Sumerian kings was the New Year festival, held annually in cities such as Ur and Nippur. During this ceremony, the king would enter the temple and reaffirm his loyalty to the gods. In some versions of the ritual, the high priest would strike the king, forcing him to confess any failures from the previous year. Only after demonstrating humility and devotion would the king be allowed to return to power. This striking moment captured the paradox of Sumerian kingship. The ruler was the most powerful man in the city, yet his authority depended on ritual submission to forces greater than himself. Divine kingship also shaped the way rulers communicated with their people. Inscriptions and dedicatory texts often emphasized the king's piety rather than his battlefield achievements. He was the shepherd of his people, chosen by the gods to protect and provide. He built temples and maintained justice not for personal glory, but to honor the divine order. This language helped forge a shared moral and religious identity among the inhabitants of each city. Of course, not all kings ruled wisely or justly. There were abuses of power, rebellions, and episodes of tyranny. Yet even these failures were interpreted through a religious lens. A king who brought ruin to his city was believed to have lost the favor of the gods. His downfall served as a warning to others. Divine kingship was not just a justification for power, it was a framework of accountability. The development of kingship also had architectural and artistic consequences. Royal palaces emerged as distinct spaces, separate from temples but equally grand. Kings commissioned reliefs, statues, and monumental stelae, upright stone slabs inscribed with proclamations or images of conquest. These artworks portrayed the king as a warrior, priest, and judge, emphasizing the multiple roles he was expected to fulfill. One of the most revealing examples of early royal art is the Stele of the Vultures, a limestone monument commemorating the victory of Eannatum, king of Lagash, over the rival city of Umma. The relief shows Eannatum leading his troops into battle, trampling enemies beneath his chariot, and receiving the blessing of the gods. It is both a military document and a theological one, asserting that divine support ensured victory. As city-states grew more ambitious, so too did their kings. The desire to expand territory and consolidate power led to more frequent wars. Rival kings clashed not only over land and water, but over claims to divine approval. The idea that one ruler could unite all of Sumer under a single God-sanctioned authority began to take shape. It was a bold vision, one that required both military genius and spiritual legitimacy. In many ways, the growing centrality of kingship marked a departure from earlier patterns of governance. It concentrated authority in the hands of individuals rather than collectives. It linked politics to religion in a way that would influence later cultures across the ancient Near East. And it laid the ideological groundwork for the rise of empires. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, Sumer was a region of powerful kings, sophisticated religious systems, and fortified cities. Yet this patchwork of competing city-states remained politically fragmented. What Sumer lacked was unity, a single power to bring order to the whole land. That unity would soon be imposed not by a Sumerian ruler, but by an outsider from the north, a man named Sargon, who would claim the blessing of the gods and forge the world's first empire. In the next section, we follow his extraordinary rise. In the centuries that followed the rise of kingship in Sumer, Mesopotamia remained a landscape of independent and often rival city-states. Each city had its own ruler, its own deity, and its own ambitions. Though cultural traditions were shared across the region, political unity remained elusive. But sometime around the 24th century BCE, a seismic shift occurred. From the northern region of Mesopotamia, a powerful figure emerged who would change the structure of power not just in Sumer but across the entire region. His name was Sargon of Akkad, and he became the founder of the world's first known empire. The story of Sargon's rise begins in Akkad, a city whose exact location remains unknown to this day, though it was likely situated somewhere near modern-day Baghdad. Unlike the southern Sumerians, Sargon was an Akkadian, a Semitic-speaking people who had lived in northern and central Mesopotamia alongside the Sumerians for generations. The Akkadians adopted many aspects of Sumerian culture, including writing, religious practices, and administrative systems. But they retained their own language and tribal structures. This blending of cultures would later become a defining feature of Sargon's empire. Sargon's origins are wrapped in legend, but historical sources provide a general outline. According to a later Sumerian text known as the Sargon legend, he was born of humble background and served as cupbearer to the king of Kish, one of the dominant city-states in northern Sumer. In this trusted court position, Sargon gained access to political networks and military resources. Eventually, he rose up and overthrew his master, establishing himself as ruler of Kish. But his ambition did not stop there. Sargon quickly set his sights on the rest of Mesopotamia. His most formidable opponent was Lugal-Zagizi, the powerful king of Umma, who had briefly managed to unite much of Sumer under his command. Lugal-Zagizi claimed divine favor and boasted of victories stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. But despite his claims of unity, his rule was fragile. Sargon launched a military campaign that led to Lugal-Zagizi's defeat and capture. According to surviving inscriptions, Sargon paraded the defeated king through the streets of Nippur in chains, a symbolic gesture that asserted not just military victory, but divine legitimacy. With Lugal-Zagizi defeated, Sargon set about consolidating his control. He established a new capital at Akkad and declared himself King of Kish, a title that carried deep political and religious weight in Sumerian tradition. He also took on a more expansive title, King of the Four Quarters, meaning ruler of the entire world as it was then known. This was not merely symbolic. Sargon led military campaigns that extended his power far beyond Sumer. He conquered Elam to the east, subjugated territories in northern Mesopotamia, and reached as far west as the Mediterranean coast. For the first time in recorded history, a single ruler controlled a vast and diverse region stretching across multiple cultures, languages, and geographies. This was the birth of imperial politics, rule over multiple peoples through a central authority. Sargon's success was not due only to military conquest, but to his administrative innovation. He placed loyal officials, often Akkadians, in positions of power across the empire. He stationed troops in key cities to deter rebellion and maintained regular communication through messengers and written records. The Akkadian Empire also marked a turning point in language and writing. While Sumerian remained in use, Akkadian became the dominant spoken language of administration and diplomacy. Cuneiform writing was adapted to suit the Akkadian language, and this fusion helped create a shared bureaucratic system that could function across vast distances. Clay tablets written in Akkadian began to appear in cities from northern Syria to southern Elam. Another defining feature of Sargon's rule was his promotion of royal ideology. Inscriptions and royal hymns portrayed him as chosen by the gods, victorious in battle, and favored by divine forces. One surviving inscription declares, "Sargon, king of the world, triumphantly marched across the sea in the east. He conquered 60 cities and subdued all the lands." While these claims may have been exaggerated, they served a political purpose, to reinforce the image of the king as both protector and unifier. Sargon's reign lasted for several decades, and during this time he faced challenges. Some Sumerian cities resisted Akkadian rule, and there were occasional rebellions. Nevertheless, the administrative and military systems he put in place proved effective. Upon his death, his dynasty continued under his sons and grandsons, who worked to maintain and expand the empire. One of the most notable of his successors was his grandson Naram-Sin, who ruled several generations later and carried on Sargon's legacy of expansion and divine kingship. Naram-Sin took the title King of the Four Quarters and even went a step further, declaring himself a god. This was unprecedented in Mesopotamian tradition. While kings were often seen as chosen by the gods, claiming divinity was a bold and controversial move. Naram-Sin had his image carved on stelae with a horned crown, a symbol usually reserved for deities. His reign further solidified the imperial structure of Akkad, but also sowed seeds of dissent among more traditional Sumerian communities. Economically, the Akkadian Empire benefited from increased trade and centralized control. Goods flowed more freely across Mesopotamia, and the empire engaged in long-distance trade with regions as far away as the Indus Valley and Anatolia. Precious stones, metals, timber, and exotic goods entered Akkadian cities, enriching the elites and supporting temple economies. Art and sculpture flourished, with new styles that combined Sumerian and Semitic motifs. The famous bronze head of an Akkadian ruler, often identified as Sargon himself, exemplifies this artistic synthesis. Yet the empire was not immune to internal and external pressures. Maintaining control over such a vast territory required constant vigilance, reliable communication, and economic stability. Over time, the empire began to strain under its own weight. Environmental stress, particularly prolonged drought, may have played a role in weakening agriculture. Simultaneously, external groups, such as the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains, began raiding the empire's eastern borders. By the end of the 22nd century BCE, the Akkadian Empire began to collapse. The central authority weakened, regional governors declared independence, and Sumerian city-states reasserted themselves. The Gutians eventually invaded and occupied parts of Mesopotamia, disrupting trade and political continuity. The age of Akkad came to an end, but its legacy would endure. The innovations of Sargon and his dynasty shaped the course of Mesopotamian history. They established a model of empire, militarily expansive, administratively organized, and ideologically grounded in divine kingship that future rulers would emulate. The Akkadian Empire demonstrated for the first time that it was possible to govern a culturally diverse and geographically vast territory through centralized control. With the fall of Akkad, Mesopotamia did not return to its earlier state of permanent fragmentation. The idea of unification had taken root, and not long after Akkad's fall, a powerful new dynasty would emerge in the southern city of Ur, reviving Sumerian culture and restoring order. In the next section, we turn to this remarkable revival known as the Third Dynasty of Ur. The Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon and expanded by his successors, stood as the most powerful political entity the ancient world had yet seen. For more than a century, it maintained control over much of Mesopotamia and beyond, integrating different peoples, languages, and traditions under a centralized rule. But no empire lasts forever. By the late 22nd century BCE, the Akkadian world began to unravel. This period of collapse was marked not by a single event, but by a combination of internal weakness, environmental disaster, and external invasions. The first signs of decline began during the later years of the Akkadian dynasty. Though the empire had brought many innovations in administration, communication, and trade, it remained dependent on agricultural productivity and the loyalty of regional governors. As drought conditions worsened and political cohesion frayed, the delicate balance of power began to slip. The center could no longer hold. One major factor in the collapse appears to have been climate. Scientific studies of ancient sediments and soil layers in the region suggest that during the late 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamia experienced a prolonged period of drought. Rainfall decreased significantly, rivers carried less water, and the once fertile fields began to yield poor harvests. Known today as the 4.2 kilo-year event, this climate shift affected civilizations across the Near East and beyond. For a society so reliant on irrigation agriculture, the consequences were severe. Crops failed, food shortages increased. Inscriptions from the period describe famine and social unrest. In one surviving Sumerian lamentation, the fields are said to have delivered nothing, and the granaries were empty. As desperation grew, the empire's social and political systems came under immense strain. These environmental stresses coincided with a breakdown in central authority. After the death of Naram-Sin, the last powerful ruler of the dynasty, his successors struggled to maintain the empire's vast and diverse holdings. Rebellions broke out in several cities. Provincial governors began to assert independence. The carefully constructed administrative network that had supported the empire started to dissolve. Amid this internal instability, new external threats emerged. Chief among them were the Gutians, a group of tribal peoples from the Zagros Mountains to the northeast. Little is known about the Gutians from their own perspective, as they left no written records. Most of what we know comes from Sumerian sources, which depict them as violent and destructive outsiders, barbarians who brought disorder and chaos. While these depictions are likely exaggerated and steeped in cultural bias, it is clear that the Gutians took advantage of Akkad's decline. They moved into the region and began to occupy key cities, disrupting trade routes and seizing power in various areas. Unlike the Akkadian rulers, the Gutians did not maintain a strong central government. Their rule is often described as fragmented and unstable. A Sumerian text from the period, sometimes called the Curse of Akkad, offers a poetic explanation for the collapse. It describes how the gods, angered by the arrogance of Naram-Sin, who had declared himself a god, decided to punish the Akkadian Empire. They withdrew their favor, sent famine, and unleashed foreign invaders. While mythological in tone, the text reflects real social memory of collapse and divine disfavor. It highlights how deeply Mesopotamian people connected political failure with cosmic disorder. The Gutian period that followed is often described in Mesopotamian literature as a dark age. Cities were depopulated, trade networks broke down, irrigation systems fell into disrepair. Administrative texts became rarer, suggesting a decrease in organized governance. In many places, urban life contracted. Some cities were abandoned altogether. However, it is important to recognize that the Gutian period was not a total collapse of civilization. Life continued in many parts of Mesopotamia, though at a reduced scale. Smaller city-states remained active, and local traditions persisted. Some scholars today argue that the Gutians may have ruled through indirect control, allowing local elites to continue governance while extracting tribute. Whatever the case, their presence marked a significant interruption in the centralized structures that had defined the Akkadian age. One region that managed to resist total breakdown was southern Sumer. Cities such as Ur, Lagash, and Eridu began to recover and reassert autonomy during the Gutian occupation. In Lagash, a notable figure named Gudea emerged, a local ruler who governed not as an emperor, but as a pious and capable city king. Gudea undertook major temple-building projects, revived economic life, and left behind inscriptions that emphasized justice, order, and devotion to the gods. Gudea's rule offers a window into the resilience of Sumerian culture, even amid imperial collapse. His inscriptions are notable for their humility and religious piety. He does not claim divinity, as Naram-Sin had, but instead presents himself as a servant of the gods. His successful reign in Lagash laid the foundation for a broader Sumerian revival that would soon follow. Eventually, the Gutians were expelled. A coalition of Sumerian city-states, led by the southern city of Uruk and later Ur, pushed back against foreign occupation. A key figure in this resurgence was Utu-Hegal, a ruler of Uruk who launched a campaign to drive the Gutians from Mesopotamia. According to his inscriptions, he defeated the Gutian king and re-established Sumerian control over the land. While Utu-Hegal's victory was significant, the full restoration of centralized power came under the leadership of Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur. Ur-Nammu would not only reunify much of Sumer, but also restore the administrative, legal, and religious systems that had faltered under Gutian rule. His reign marked the beginning of what historians now call the Neo-Sumerian period. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire thus stands as a pivotal moment in Mesopotamian history. It revealed the vulnerabilities of early empires, their dependence on climate stability, their susceptibility to rebellion, and the challenges of maintaining control across diverse regions. Yet it also demonstrated the resilience of Mesopotamian society. Despite foreign invasions and ecological hardship, the core institutions of Sumerian civilization endured. The Akkadian collapse paved the way for a Sumerian renaissance. In the next section, we explore the rise of the third dynasty of Ur and how a new generation of rulers rebuilt and reimagined the ancient cities of the south. Following the fragmentation and hardship that marked the end of the Akkadian Empire, Mesopotamia entered a period of reorganization. The collapse had left city-states weakened, fields neglected, and institutions in disrepair. But out of this era of instability rose a new power in the south, determined not only to restore order, but also to revive and elevate Sumerian traditions. This new political force emerged in the ancient city of Ur, and under the leadership of its kings, the third dynasty of Ur would forge what historians call the Neo-Sumerian Empire. The rise of the third dynasty began in the late 22nd century BCE, with the figure of Ur-Nammu, a former governor who seized power during a time of transition. While Utu-Hegal of Uruk had expelled the Gutians and briefly claimed dominance, it was Ur-Nammu who consolidated that victory and transformed it into lasting political authority. He declared himself king of Ur and then extended his influence across much of Sumer and Akkad, re-establishing centralized governance and launching an ambitious program of reform and reconstruction. Ur-Nammu's reign marked a clear shift in the style and substance of kingship. Unlike some earlier rulers who had claimed divinity or ruled through raw force, Ur-Nammu presented himself as a servant of the gods and a restorer of divine order. His authority was closely tied to the temple, but his government was strikingly secular in its administrative effectiveness. He is best remembered today for laying the foundations of a legal and bureaucratic state that operated through codified rules, written records, and state oversight. One of his most enduring legacies was the creation of the Code of Ur-Nammu, which is among the oldest known legal codes in world history. Written in Sumerian and inscribed on tablets, the code laid out legal principles covering civil, criminal, and economic matters. It addressed issues such as theft, assault, debt, marriage, and property rights. Penalties were often monetary, reflecting a system that emphasized restitution and regulation rather than harsh physical punishment. The existence of such a code reveals a society seeking order after a time of chaos. It also shows how the idea of justice was deeply integrated with governance. Kingship was not just about conquest, it was about maintaining fairness and social harmony. In one surviving prologue to the code, Ur-Nammu claims that he was appointed by the gods to establish justice in the land, banish malice and violence, and ensure that the strong did not oppress the weak. Under Ur-Nammu and his successors, particularly his son Shulgi, the third dynasty of Ur expanded its reach. Shulgi, who ruled for nearly half a century, transformed the kingdom into a highly organized state. He reorganized the administrative structure of the empire, creating provinces governed by officials loyal to the crown. He established a standardized system of weights and measures, improved the calendar, and maintained extensive communication networks across his territories. One of Shulgi's most significant achievements was the creation of a royal road system. This network of routes connected the major cities and administrative centers of the empire, allowing for efficient movement of troops, messengers, and goods. At intervals along these roads were rest stations and supply posts, ensuring that royal emissaries could travel quickly and safely. This infrastructure allowed the central government to exert control over distant regions and respond rapidly to local issues. Economically, the empire thrived. The state managed large agricultural estates and collected tribute from vassal cities. Massive storehouses kept supplies of grain and livestock, which could be distributed during times of need. Temples and palaces functioned as economic hubs, overseeing workshops, trade, and redistribution. The use of cuneiform continued to flourish, with scribes documenting everything from legal transactions and administrative orders to literary works and hymns. One of the most remarkable features of this period was the emphasis on architecture and monumental construction. Ur-Nammu initiated the rebuilding of major temples across the land, and nowhere was this more evident than in the city of Ur itself. There, he commissioned the construction of the great ziggurat of Ur, a massive stepped pyramid dedicated to the moon god Nana, the city's patron deity. The ziggurat, built from mud brick and faced with baked bricks set in bitumen, was the centerpiece of a grand temple complex. Its massive platforms rose in tiers, supporting a shrine at the top that was believed to bring the priestly class closer to the heavens. The structure symbolized both religious devotion and royal power. It was a visible statement that order and piety had been restored. Shulgi continued his father's building campaigns and added an important ideological dimension to kingship. In royal hymns and inscriptions, he praised his own learning, strength, and piety. He claimed mastery of multiple languages and described himself as a lawgiver and scholar. His self-promotion bordered on the divine, though he stopped short of claiming outright godhood as Naram-Sin had once done. Culturally, the Neo-Sumerian period saw a revival of Sumerian literature and learning. Scribes compiled and copied earlier texts, while poets and theologians created new works. The period produced a rich body of hymns, myths, proverbs, and epic tales. Many of these were recorded in the Sumerian language, which by then was no longer widely spoken but retained its status as the language of learning and liturgy, much like Latin in later European history. Education became increasingly institutionalized. Young scribes were trained in tablet houses where they learned to read and write cuneiform, perform calculations, and recite canonical texts. This educational system helped preserve a shared cultural identity across the empire, even as Akkadian continued to spread as the language of daily speech. Despite its achievements, the third dynasty of Ur was not without challenges. The empire faced pressure from its borders, particularly from the east. The Elamites, a powerful people from the Iranian plateau, remained a constant threat. Internal unrest, heavy taxation, and forced labor obligations also created tension among the population. The cost of maintaining a vast administrative and military system placed strain on the state's resources. By the end of the 21st century BCE, the empire began to weaken. The final ruler of the dynasty, Ibbi-Sin, struggled to maintain control as both internal and external pressures mounted. Provinces rebelled, trade networks faltered, and the Elamites launched invasions into southern Mesopotamia. Around the year 2000 BCE, the city of Ur fell, marking the end of the Third Dynasty and the collapse of centralized Sumerian rule. Yet the legacy of the Neo-Sumerian revival endured. The administrative structures, legal traditions, and cultural institutions developed during this period would continue to influence future Mesopotamian states. Later empires, such as Babylon and Assyria, built upon the foundations laid by Ur-Nammu and Shulgi. The ideal of a just king ruling with divine approval and legal authority remained central to Mesopotamian political thought for centuries. The fall of Ur did not mean the end of civilization in Mesopotamia. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase, one shaped by migration, cultural blending, and political transformation. Into the power vacuum stepped new groups, including the Amorites and Elamites, who would redefine the political map of the region. In the next section, we explore how the fall of Ur gave rise to these new powers and set the stage for the rise of Babylon. In the vast sweep of human civilization, few inventions have been as vital to societal structure as the concept of law. From the earliest villages to the great urban centers of Mesopotamia, people faced the challenge of living together in complex, interdependent communities. As populations expanded and cities became hubs of trade, administration, and religion, it became necessary to create systems that could regulate behavior, resolve disputes, and protect both property and life. In this context, one of history's most significant milestones emerged, the earliest known written legal code. That achievement belongs to Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur. The Code of Ur-Nammu predates more famous collections of laws, such as the later Code of Hammurabi, by several centuries. Composed during the reign of Ur-Nammu in the late 22nd or early 21st century BCE, this legal code marks the beginning of formalized written jurisprudence in recorded history. Written in Sumerian and inscribed on clay tablets, the code represented a momentous shift in the way justice was conceived and administered. Prior to such codes, legal practices in Mesopotamia likely relied on customary law, communal judgment, or the decisions of local officials. While disputes could be resolved through tradition or the authority of temple or city leaders, the lack of a clear written standard left much to interpretation. Ur-Nammu's innovation lay in taking these expectations and responsibilities and inscribing them in permanent form, accessible not only to officials, but to any literate member of society. The surviving fragments of the Code of Ur-Nammu are incomplete, but enough remains to provide a clear sense of its structure and values. The prologue to the code emphasizes the king's divine mandate and commitment to justice. It states that Ur-Nammu was chosen by the gods An and Enlil to establish equity in the land, banish malediction and violence, and ensure that the strong did not harm the weak. This introduction is crucial. It frames law not merely as a tool of governance, but as a moral duty entrusted by the divine. The laws themselves are concise and structured in a conditional format. If a man does X, then Y is the consequence. These provisions covered a wide range of civil and criminal matters. They included punishments for theft, assault, and adultery, as well as guidelines for marriage arrangements, slave rights, and financial obligations. One striking feature of the Code of Ur-Nammu is its use of fines as the primary form of punishment. Rather than inflicting physical harm, the code frequently imposed monetary penalties to compensate victims or restore balance. For example, if a man caused bodily injury to another, he was to pay a fixed amount of silver, depending on the severity of the injury. This approach reflected a focus on restitution rather than retribution. Capital punishment did exist in some extreme cases, such as murder, robbery, or certain sexual crimes, but it was not the norm. The relative restraint of the code offers insight into the values of the Neo-Sumerian state. It sought not only to punish wrongdoing, but to stabilize social and economic relationships through clear and predictable rules. The code also addressed social hierarchy. Different penalties were prescribed depending on the status of the individuals involved. For example, harming a free citizen might result in a heavier fine than harming a slave. While this may seem unjust by modern standards, it reflected the stratified nature of Sumerian society, where legal rights and responsibilities varied by class, gender, and occupation. Still, the existence of a legal code at all suggested a level of transparency and consistency that had previously been rare. It signaled that justice was not arbitrary. It could be documented, referenced, and upheld through institutions. This was an essential development for a complex, literate society like that of the third dynasty of Ur. Scribes played a central role in the implementation of these laws. They recorded contracts, transcribed disputes, and preserved legal texts. Their work created an archive of civic life, much of which has survived to the present day. Tablets have been found detailing land transactions, loan agreements, marriage contracts, and court verdicts, all part of the legal fabric woven during this period. Temples and palaces served as centers of legal activity. Judges or appointed officials would hear cases, examine evidence, and consult written laws. While common citizens may not have read the code directly, they would have known of its authority and seen it reflected in the procedures of justice. The use of seals to authenticate documents added another layer of formal validation to legal affairs. The moral language of the code is also worth noting. The prologue emphasizes not just order, but fairness. The king is described as a protector of widows and orphans, as one who shed light on the land. These ideals echoed the broader religious worldview of the time, in which kings were not only political leaders but caretakers of divine harmony. By setting standards for conduct and accountability, the Code of Ur-Nammu contributed to the consolidation of state authority. It helped legitimize the rule of Ur-Nammu and his successors, providing a foundation for governance based not solely on military strength or religious ritual, but on legal integrity. This was a powerful tool for unification in a culturally and economically diverse empire. The influence of the Code of Ur-Nammu extended beyond his lifetime. It served as a model for later legal collections in Mesopotamia, including those of Eshnunna and Lipit Ishtar, and eventually Hammurabi of Babylon. Each of these later codes would borrow the basic structure pioneered under Ur-Nammu, combining a divine prologue, conditional laws, and social distinctions into a coherent legal framework. In modern times, the Code of Ur-Nammu remains a critical piece of historical evidence. It offers scholars a glimpse into the everyday lives of ancient Mesopotamians, how they handled conflict, valued justice, and navigated the complexities of urban society. It reveals a world where laws were not merely edicts from above, but part of a negotiated relationship between ruler, citizen, and the divine. Most importantly, it marks the beginning of law as an institution, not just a tradition. In creating a written code, Ur-Nammu laid the foundation for thousands of years of legal thought. His vision of justice, though rooted in a distant and different world, continues to echo in the legal systems of today. As the third dynasty of Ur reached its height, this legal foundation helped strengthen the state and guide its expansion. But stability in Mesopotamia never lasted indefinitely. The empire that Ur-Nammu built would soon face new challenges, including incursions from the Elamites to the east and the migration of Amorite tribes into the region. In the next section, we turn to these new dynamics and the ultimate fall of Ur, as shifting populations and external pressures reshaped the future of Mesopotamia. As the third dynasty of Ur approached the end of its golden age in the early 21st century BCE, the forces that had once unified southern Mesopotamia began to weaken. The careful balance of centralized administration, economic productivity, and divine kingship started to fray. Pressures came from both within and beyond the borders of the empire. Among the most decisive of these challenges were the incursions of the Elamites from the east and the growing presence of a group of nomadic people known as the Amorites. The Amorites were Semitic-speaking pastoralists originating from the western deserts and river valleys of modern-day Syria. For generations, they had lived on the periphery of settled Mesopotamian life, engaging in limited trade and occasional conflict with the Sumerian cities. They were not a single unified group, but rather a collection of tribal clans and extended families who moved seasonally with their herds and adapted to changing conditions. Beginning in the late stages of the third dynasty of Ur, Amorite groups began to migrate in increasing numbers into the settled regions of southern Mesopotamia. The reasons for this movement were likely a combination of population pressures, changing climate conditions, and the lure of fertile land and urban wealth. As the Neo-Sumerian state struggled to maintain control over its territories, these mobile tribes found new opportunities to settle, infiltrate, and eventually take power. The Amorite migration did not come in the form of a single invasion. Instead, it occurred gradually and unevenly. At first, Amorites served as seasonal laborers, herders, and soldiers for hire in Sumerian cities. They were often accepted into society under strict legal and social limits. Over time, however, some Amorite clans gained wealth, influence, and land, eventually forming their own local dynasties in the smaller cities and outer provinces of the region. While the Amorites were moving in from the west, the empire faced a more immediate military threat from the east. The Elamites, a powerful people based in the region of modern southwestern Iran, had long competed with Mesopotamian rulers for control of trade routes and borderlands. As the central authority of Ur weakened, the Elamites seized their opportunity. Their armies launched raids into Sumerian territory, targeting key cities and trade centers. The final decades of the Third Dynasty were marked by economic strain, administrative corruption, and rising social unrest. Tax burdens increased as rulers tried to maintain their infrastructure and military defenses. There is evidence that conscription and forced labor became more severe, leading to widespread dissatisfaction. Meanwhile, local governors and city rulers began to assert more independence, undermining the unity that had defined the empire under Ur-Nammu and Shulgi. Ibbi-Sin, the last king of Ur, struggled to hold the crumbling state together. His reign, which began with hopes of restoring strength, soon turned into a desperate effort to preserve what remained. He built fortifications, dispatched envoys, and issued proclamations appealing to the gods for support. But the situation deteriorated rapidly. A critical blow came when the Elamites, in alliance with rebellious Sumerian cities and possibly aided by Amorite leaders, launched a full-scale assault on the city of Ur. The once great capital, with its ziggurats, temples, and administrative complexes, fell to the invaders. Ibbi-Sin was captured and taken in chains to Elam, a humiliating end to a dynasty that had once claimed to rule all of Sumer and Akkad. The fall of Ur marked more than the end of a political dynasty. It represented the collapse of the last great native Sumerian empire. While elements of Sumerian culture would continue to influence later societies, the age of independent Sumerian dominance in Mesopotamia had come to an end. In the aftermath of Ur's collapse, Mesopotamia entered a period of fragmentation and transformation. Amorite dynasties emerged in several important cities, including Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and eventually Babylon. These new city-states were ruled by leaders of Amorite descent, many of whom adopted Sumerian traditions of kingship, religious practice, and administration. They built temples, issued laws, and patronized scribes who continued to write in Sumerian as a sacred and scholarly language, even as Akkadian became the dominant spoken tongue. One notable example is the city of Isin, where an Amorite ruler named Ishbi-Era established a new dynasty that claimed to inherit the legacy of Ur. Ishbi-Era had once served as a governor under Ibbi-Sin, but declared independence as the central government faltered. He positioned himself as a restorer of order and piety, continuing temple construction and issuing decrees that emphasized justice and divine favor. Similar developments occurred in Larsa, where another Amorite line rose to power and competed with Isin for dominance over southern Mesopotamia. These two cities would engage in a prolonged rivalry, each attempting to claim legitimacy as the true successor to Ur's legacy. In the absence of a unifying empire, power shifted frequently between these emerging centers. The Amorite rulers, though new to the region, were not cultural outsiders. They adopted the existing administrative systems, respected the authority of the temples, and continued many of the traditions of their Sumerian predecessors. Their rule represented a fusion of cultures, Semitic and Sumerian, tribal and urban. This blending would shape the character of Mesopotamian civilization for centuries to come. Trade also resumed during this time, albeit on a more localized scale. With the major imperial systems gone, cities managed their own economies and diplomatic ties. Merchants traveled between independent centers, and scribes kept careful records of goods exchanged, debts owed, and contracts agreed upon. Agricultural production gradually recovered as irrigation systems were repaired and restored. Yet the political landscape remained unstable. No single power was strong enough to dominate the region entirely. City-states formed alliances, broke treaties, and waged war over fertile land, strategic positions, and claims to legitimacy. It was a time of opportunity and uncertainty, a transitional era shaped by the movement of peoples and the reshaping of identities. The Amorite migration and the fall of Ur also altered the religious geography of Mesopotamia. While traditional deities such as Enlil, Inanna, and Nana remained central, new regional cults gained prominence. Local rulers promoted the worship of their own patron gods and built new temples to honor them. This religious decentralization reflected the political fragmentation of the era. Despite the instability, this period laid the foundation for the next great chapter in Mesopotamian history, In one of the many Amorite-ruled cities, Babylon, a small but rising kingdom was beginning to assert itself. Though it had played a minor role during the fall of Ur, Babylon would soon rise to prominence under the leadership of a man whose name would become synonymous with ancient law and imperial greatness, Hammurabi. In the turbulent centuries following the fall of the third dynasty of Ur, southern Mesopotamia became a chessboard of competing city-states. Amorite dynasties held sway over places like Isin, Larsa, and Eshnunna, while smaller polities and former Sumerian centers sought to re-establish their place in a rapidly changing political environment. Amid this fragmented landscape, one city, long considered a minor player, began its rise toward prominence: Babylon. Located near the midpoint between Sumer to the south and Akkad to the north, Babylon was strategically situated along the Euphrates River. This location would eventually enable it to control major trade routes and act as a gateway between the agriculturally rich south and the militarized north. But in its early days, Babylon was an unremarkable settlement. That would change in the early 18th century BCE with the ascent of its most renowned ruler, Hammurabi. Hammurabi inherited the throne of Babylon around the year 1792 BCE, though some scholarly reconstructions suggest slightly different dates. He was a member of an Amorite dynasty that had established control over the city several generations earlier. When Hammurabi became king, Babylon was still small in influence, overshadowed by regional powers such as Larsa to the south and Eshnunna to the northeast. His early reign focused on consolidating internal stability, strengthening administrative systems, and building defensive infrastructure. What set Hammurabi apart from his predecessors and from many of his rivals was a combination of military acumen, diplomatic savvy, and legal innovation. He skillfully navigated the volatile regional politics, forming alliances when advantageous and waging war when necessary. Rather than launching an immediate campaign of conquest, Hammurabi initially pursued a pragmatic approach. He improved irrigation systems, promoted trade, and invested in temples and civic architecture, fostering loyalty among his subjects. Over time, circumstances provided Hammurabi with opportunities to expand. The city of Elam, long a threat to Mesopotamian stability, launched attacks against several Mesopotamian city-states, weakening them and straining their alliances. Eshnunna and Larsa, once powerful centers, became vulnerable. Hammurabi took advantage of this shifting balance of power. By forging strategic alliances and presenting himself as a defender of justice and divine order, Hammurabi gradually gained the support of other rulers and cities. He employed a classic tactic of Mesopotamian statecraft, claiming to act under divine mandate, particularly in the name of Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon. While Marduk had once been a minor god in the Sumerian pantheon under Hammurabi, he became the supreme figure, a symbolic elevation that mirrored the city's growing political importance. In a series of carefully timed military campaigns, Hammurabi defeated rival kings and brought their cities under his control. He first struck northward, neutralizing Eshnunna and securing the upper Tigris. Then he turned south, conquering Larsa, a long-standing rival of Babylon. Finally, he brought the old Akkadian and Sumerian centers, Uruk, and Nippur, into his domain. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi had transformed Babylon into the capital of a unified Mesopotamian kingdom. His conquests were not only military victories, but ideological ones. In his inscriptions, Hammurabi emphasized his role as a shepherd king, chosen by the gods to uphold peace and order. He portrayed his wars not as conquests, but as righteous actions meant to punish the wicked and protect the innocent. This language was not merely propaganda, it was rooted in Mesopotamian tradition, where kings were expected to maintain cosmic balance by enforcing justice. The most enduring legacy of Hammurabi's reign, beyond his political unification of Mesopotamia, was his codification of law. Known today as the Code of Hammurabi, this monumental collection of legal rulings was inscribed on a tall diorite stele and placed in a public space for all to see. The top of the stele depicts Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the god of justice, reinforcing the divine origins of his rulings. The code itself consists of nearly 300 laws, covering a vast array of civil, criminal, economic, and family matters. Topics range from theft and assault to contracts, inheritance, marriage, and slave ownership. Like earlier legal codes, it is written in conditional format. If a man does X, then Y shall follow. But unlike earlier codes, the Code of Hammurabi covers a broader social spectrum and addresses more nuanced scenarios. One striking feature of Hammurabi's code is its explicit recognition of social hierarchy. Penalties differ according to the status of the offender and the victim. For instance, harming a nobleman carried a harsher penalty than harming a commoner, and slaves were granted certain protections but remained legally subordinate. The law aimed to reflect the structure of society, not to impose modern notions of equality. Yet within this stratified framework, Hammurabi's code reflects a desire to regulate society through predictable and standardized justice. It sought to protect property, prevent abuse, and define obligations. Even those of lower status had recourse to legal remedies. The prominence of laws concerning trade and contract enforcement speaks to a society in which commerce and wealth were central to urban life. The code also emphasized family and gender roles. Laws governed marriage, divorce, inheritance, and dowries, aiming to preserve family order and protect economic assets. While women had fewer legal rights than men, the code provided protections against abandonment and unjust treatment. Widows and priestesses received special provisions, reflecting their unique roles in society. Hammurabi's legal reforms strengthened his rule by creating a sense of shared justice across a diverse population. In a kingdom formed from conquered city-states with varied traditions, the code served as a unifying tool. It institutionalized fairness, at least as defined by elite norms, and promoted the king as the guarantor of law and order. Alongside his legal and military achievements, Hammurabi invested heavily in civic and religious infrastructure. Temples were restored and expanded, canals and walls were repaired, and the worship of Marduk was elevated throughout the empire. Babylon, once a secondary city, became the symbolic and administrative heart of the region. Despite his successes, Hammurabi's empire faced the same challenge that had brought down previous Mesopotamian empires: how to maintain unity over time. After his death, his successors struggled to retain control. The central government weakened, subject cities rebelled, and new powers began to rise on the periphery. Yet the memory of Hammurabi's reign endured. Babylon had entered history as a major power, and it would re-emerge again and again as a center of culture, learning, and kingship. Hammurabi's legacy, especially his legal code, was copied and studied for centuries. Even in later periods, scribes training in law schools would transcribe the Code of Hammurabi as a foundational text. His reign marked a turning point, not just for Babylon, but for the entire Mesopotamian world. For the first time since the fall of Ur, a single ruler had managed to reunite the region and shape it according to a coherent legal and religious vision. Through a blend of conquest, diplomacy, and legal innovation, Hammurabi forged an enduring model of kingship. But the story of Babylon was far from over. Though the kingdom would decline after Hammurabi's death, it would one day rise again with even greater splendor under a new dynasty. In the meantime, the next section will explore the intellectual and scientific developments that flourished during the Old Babylonian period, advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and literature that would influence civilizations for generations to come. The rule of Hammurabi was marked by more than conquest and political unification. Among his most profound contributions to history was the formalization of law into a visible, coherent, and widely disseminated legal code. The Code of Hammurabi stands today as one of the earliest and most comprehensive examples of written legislation, a landmark not just in Mesopotamian history, but in the broader development of human governance and justice. When Hammurabi came to power in Babylon during the early 18th century BCE, he inherited a region fragmented by rival city-states and marked by a long tradition of customary law. Though earlier kings, including Ur-Nammu and Lipit-Ishtar, had issued legal codes in Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, Hammurabi's code was more ambitious in scope, detail, and public visibility. He sought to do more than just resolve disputes. He aimed to present a vision of social order, endorsed by the gods and enforced by the king. The Code of Hammurabi was inscribed on a tall, black diorite stele, standing over 7 feet in height. This stone monument was set up in a prominent temple space for all to see, at least for those who could read. At the top of the stele is a relief showing Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and divine judge, who bestows upon the king a rod and ring, symbols of authority. This image signified that the code was not merely a human invention, but a divine mandate. Below the image are nearly 300 laws written in Akkadian cuneiform script. These laws covered a wide range of issues including civil disputes, criminal offenses, family relations, commerce, property, labor, and even professional conduct. They provide a remarkable window into the values, concerns, and structures of Babylonian society. The code is structured in a series of conditional clauses. If a man does X, then Y shall happen. These conditional statements create consistency and predictability. They outline not just prohibitions and punishments, but the underlying norms that governed behavior. For example, if a builder constructed a house and it collapsed, killing the owner's son, then the builder's son would be put to death. This is an example of the principle of retributive justice, sometimes summarized as an eye for an eye. That phrase, in fact, does appear in the code. Yet despite its seemingly harsh approach, the Code of Hammurabi was not a uniformly brutal document. Many offenses, particularly those involving property disputes or minor injuries, were met with monetary compensation. The code also contained measures to protect the vulnerable, widows, orphans, and debtors, though always within a socially stratified framework. Social status played a central role in how justice was administered. The code distinguishes among 3 major social classes: the Awilu, free elite male, the Mushkenu, a free person of lower status, and the Wardu, slave. Penalties for the same offense could differ based on the class of the victim and the perpetrator. For example, injuring a nobleman might require a heavier fine than injuring a commoner. While this hierarchy may seem unjust from a modern perspective, it reflected the stratified and patriarchal nature of Mesopotamian society. Slavery, a common institution throughout Mesopotamia, is addressed extensively in the code. Slaves were regarded as property but were granted certain protections under the law. For example, if a master killed a slave belonging to another man, he was required to pay compensation. The code also included laws governing the conditions under which a slave might earn freedom, particularly in cases of debt servitude. Family law is another prominent feature. Marriage, dowries, inheritance, and the duties of husbands and wives are carefully regulated. Adultery, false accusations, and divorce are addressed with specific punishments and procedures. The goal was to preserve household stability, maintain social order, and protect property rights within the family. In matters of commerce, the code covers contracts, loans, interest rates, theft, and fraud. It holds merchants, traders, and artisans to strict standards. If a merchant failed to honor a contract or a boatman sank a vessel due to negligence, the code prescribed consequences. These laws reflect the complexity of economic life in Babylon and the importance of enforceable agreements. One particularly forward-thinking aspect of the code is its regulation of professional services. Physicians, builders, and ship captains were held accountable for their work. A doctor who caused the death of a patient through surgical error could face the loss of a hand. At the same time, the code specified standard fees for medical treatment and labor. These details indicate a highly developed system of occupational regulation and public accountability. The code also reveals the presence of legal mechanisms beyond the king himself. Judges, witnesses, and written contracts all played roles in the legal process. Cases could be brought before local courts, where evidence was presented and verdicts rendered. In some instances, oath-taking and trial by ordeal were used when evidence was inconclusive. These practices reflect a blend of formal legal procedure and religious belief in divine justice. The prologue and epilogue of the code are especially revealing. In the prologue, Hammurabi states that he was called by the gods to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong may not oppress the weak. This declaration is not just a political statement, but a theological claim, positioning the king as the guarantor of divine will on earth. In the epilogue, Hammurabi offers instructions for future rulers to follow his laws and warns of divine punishment for any king who would deface or disregard the stele. He also invites the oppressed to come before the monument and read the laws to seek justice. This public orientation of the code, even if not accessible to the illiterate masses, was symbolically powerful. It reinforced the image of the king as a protector and administrator of moral order. The Code of Hammurabi had lasting influence. It was copied and referenced for generations and formed the basis for later legal traditions across Mesopotamia. Though eventually superseded by other dynasties and codes, its legacy lived on in the training of scribes and the public memory of Hammurabi as a just and wise ruler. In the broader history of law, Hammurabi's code is a milestone. It demonstrated that societies could codify expectations, address grievances, and resolve conflicts through publicly declared standards. While the idea of law was not new, the idea of law as a public institution administered through state authority was advanced significantly by Hammurabi's work. Moreover, the code illustrates how legal systems reflect and shape the values of their time. In Babylon, law was not only about control, it was a tool of legitimacy, a source of stability, and a bridge between divine and earthly authority. It linked palace, temple, and marketplace into a coherent vision of social order. As Babylon emerged as a powerful state, its legal foundation helped hold together a diverse population drawn from different regions and traditions. The Code of Hammurabi became a pillar of that unity, a shared reference for justice that transcended city walls and tribal affiliations. But law alone could not preserve an empire forever. After Hammurabi's death, Babylon would face renewed challenges as rival powers re-emerged and internal tensions grew. Yet the intellectual and cultural achievements of his reign would endure. In the next section, we explore the flourishing of science, literature, and learning during the Old Babylonian period, a time when the pursuit of knowledge became a defining feature of Mesopotamian civilization. While Hammurabi is best remembered for his legal code and military conquests, the legacy of the Old Babylonian period extends far beyond politics and governance. This era, roughly spanning from the early 18th century BCE through the mid-16th century BCE, witnessed a flourishing of intellectual activity. Babylonian scribes, scholars, and priests built upon centuries of inherited Sumerian and Akkadian knowledge to develop advanced systems of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. These achievements would echo not only across Mesopotamia, but far into the future, informing the sciences of later civilizations in the Near East, Greece, and beyond. The foundation of Old Babylonian learning lay in the scribal schools, known in Sumerian as eduba, or tablet houses. These institutions trained a select class of boys, usually from elite or priestly families, in the art of writing and the disciplines associated with it. The education was rigorous, beginning with the memorization of hundreds of cuneiform signs and progressing through increasingly complex exercises in Sumerian and Akkadian grammar, mathematics, and literary composition. Scribal students would spend years copying texts, reciting standard phrases, and composing practice tablets. Many such student exercises have been recovered from archaeological sites, allowing modern scholars to reconstruct the curriculum and teaching methods. The emphasis on rote repetition and standardization ensured a high level of consistency across the scribal class. In effect, this system created a professional bureaucracy equipped not only to manage the state's administration, but also to preserve and develop intellectual traditions. One of the most impressive accomplishments of the Old Babylonian period was in the field of mathematics. Babylonian mathematicians developed a place value system based on base 60, a sexagesimal system. This mathematical framework allowed for efficient calculations, the use of fractions, and the solving of complex problems involving geometry and algebra. Though it may appear unusual by modern standards, the base 60 system is still with us today in the way we divide hours, minutes, and degrees. Mathematical tablets from the period reveal an astonishing level of sophistication. Babylonian scribes solved quadratic and cubic equations, calculated areas of geometric shapes, and even explored principles that resemble elements of the Pythagorean theorem, more than a millennium before the time of Pythagoras. One famous tablet, known today as Plimpton 322, contains a table of numbers that represents a clear understanding of right-angled triangles, all expressed within their base 60 framework. This mathematical knowledge was not purely theoretical. It had practical applications in areas such as land surveying, construction, taxation, and trade. Scribes used these tools to measure fields, calculate the volumes of storage containers, and keep accurate accounts of commodities. Mathematics also intersected with astronomy, where precise calculations of time and celestial motion were necessary for developing calendars and forecasting events. Astronomy and astrology, though often merged in ancient Mesopotamia, also advanced significantly during the Old Babylonian period. Babylonian astronomers carefully recorded the movements of celestial bodies, the sun, moon, stars, and planets. These observations were used not only for religious and agricultural purposes, but also to develop early forms of predictive astrology. The Babylonians understood that lunar and solar cycles followed observable patterns. They identified months based on the moon's phases and organized the year into 12 lunar months with periodic adjustments to maintain alignment with the solar year. Temples employed astronomer priests to observe the skies, record omens, and interpret their meaning. These practices laid the groundwork for the systematic astronomical records that would become more prominent in later periods, particularly under the Neo-Babylonian and Persian empires. Medicine also saw notable developments in Old Babylon. Medical texts from the period show a mixture of empirical observation and supernatural belief. Illnesses were often attributed to the actions of gods, demons, or the breaking of taboos. However, Babylonian healers also used physical remedies and observed symptoms with great care. They compiled lists of symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments in texts known as Ashiputu, or exorcist handbooks. These medical texts included incantations to drive out evil spirits alongside prescriptions involving herbs, poultices, and surgical techniques. While much of Babylonian medicine remained entangled with magical thinking, there was also a growing awareness of cause and effect, pattern recognition, and categorization. This blend of ritual and reason reflects the worldview of the time, in which the natural and supernatural were deeply intertwined. The Old Babylonian period also produced a rich literary tradition. Scribes preserved earlier Sumerian works and composed new ones in Akkadian, creating a bilingual literary culture that bridged the past and present. This was the era when many foundational texts of Mesopotamian literature were written down, edited, and copied for future generations. One of the most famous works to be compiled during this period was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale that had circulated in earlier Sumerian versions, but found its fuller form in Old Babylonian Akkadian. The epic recounts the adventures of Gilgamesh, the semi-divine king of Uruk, as he confronts loss, mortality, and the limits of human achievement. Its themes of friendship, power, grief, and the search for meaning continue to resonate across cultures and ages. Other literary texts from the period include proverbs, hymns, laments, wisdom literature, and philosophical dialogues. These writings were used for both religious ritual and moral instruction. They offered reflections on fate, divine justice, and the responsibilities of rulers and citizens. The creation and transmission of such literature ensured the continuity of cultural identity across the rise and fall of dynasties. In addition to literature, the Old Babylonian period was marked by a strong interest in lexicography, the systematic organization of words. Scribes created extensive word lists, bilingual dictionaries, and synonym tables. These tools helped standardize the scribal profession and facilitated communication across linguistic boundaries. They also reflect an early fascination with language itself, a recognition of its power and complexity. This intellectual vitality was closely tied to the religious institutions of Babylon. Temples were not only centers of worship, but also libraries, archives, and schools. Priests and scribes maintained collections of texts, performed rituals, and engaged in scholarly activity. The close relationship between religious authority and knowledge production gave Babylonian scholarship both divine legitimacy and institutional support. At the center of it all stood the god Marduk, whose rise in Babylonian theology paralleled the city's political ascent. As Marduk became the chief deity of the Babylonian pantheon, his temple, the Esagila, became a major center of ritual, learning, and administration. Within its walls, priests conducted astronomical observations, prepared ceremonial calendars, and oversaw educational activities. Despite political changes that followed Hammurabi's death, Babylon retained its cultural and intellectual influence. The city became a beacon of learning, drawing scholars and scribes from surrounding regions. Even as military power shifted, the prestige of Babylonian science, literature, and religion endured. The knowledge developed during the Old Babylonian period did not remain confined to Mesopotamia. In later centuries, elements of Babylonian mathematics, astronomy, and divination spread across the ancient Near East, influencing the intellectual traditions of the Hittites, Egyptians, Persians, and eventually the Greeks. The legacy of this era's learning would echo in Hellenistic astronomy, Roman engineering, and medieval science. The Old Babylonian period thus represents a turning point in the history of knowledge. It was a time when the tools of writing, calculation, and observation were brought together in powerful new ways. Scribes were not merely record keepers, they were thinkers, problem solvers, and transmitters of wisdom. As the political unity forged by Hammurabi began to unravel, and new challenges arose from external powers, the intellectual traditions of Babylon would continue to shape the region. In the next section, we turn to the rise of the Kassites, a foreign dynasty that would rule Babylon for centuries, preserving much of its cultural heritage while adapting it to new circumstances. Following the death of Hammurabi, the empire he forged began to weaken. His successors were unable to maintain the political unity and territorial control that had defined his reign. As the Old Babylonian state fragmented, new regional powers emerged, and invasions from external groups further destabilized the region. Among these groups were the Hittites, who, in a dramatic and short-lived campaign, sacked the city of Babylon itself around the middle of the 16th century BCE. However, the Hittites did not remain to occupy the city. Their departure created a power vacuum that would soon be filled by a foreign people who, over time, would integrate deeply into Mesopotamian culture: the Kassites. The Kassites were a group of people likely originating in the Zagros Mountains to the northeast of Mesopotamia. Their language, now only partially understood, does not appear to have been Semitic or Indo-European, which sets them apart linguistically from most of their contemporaries. Despite their foreign origins, the Kassites would go on to rule Babylon for more than 400 years, making theirs the longest-lasting dynasty in Babylonian history. The rise of the Kassites did not begin with sudden conquest. Instead, it was a gradual process of settlement, alliance building, and eventual domination. By inserting themselves into the region's political vacuum and aligning with local elites, the Kassites were able to take control of Babylon peacefully or with minimal conflict. Once in power, they proved to be capable administrators and stewards of Babylonian traditions. One of the most remarkable aspects of Kassite rule is how fully the new dynasty adopted and preserved Babylonian culture. Rather than imposing their own customs, the Kassites embraced the city's existing religious practices, legal systems, and administrative frameworks. They restored temples, continued the worship of Marduk as the chief deity, and adopted the Akkadian language for official use. This cultural continuity helped legitimize their rule in the eyes of the population and ensured stability over the long term. The Kassite kings took on traditional Mesopotamian titles and participated in ritual life in ways indistinguishable from earlier native rulers. The most famous of these kings, Kurigalzu I, founded a new capital called Dur-Kurigalzu, located near present-day Baghdad. The city included a ziggurat, palaces, and temples dedicated to Mesopotamian gods, constructed in traditional architectural styles. It became an important administrative and ceremonial center, symbolizing both Kassite identity and loyalty to Babylonian traditions. The Kassite period is often characterized as one of political decentralization but cultural continuity. The Kassites did not seek to recreate Hammurabi's empire. Instead, they governed a smaller, more manageable territory centered around Babylon and its surrounding regions. Provincial governors, known as shaknu, were appointed to oversee different regions and were often drawn from local populations. This allowed the Kassites to maintain local support and reduce the risk of rebellion. In international affairs, the Kassite kings proved to be shrewd diplomats. During the Late Bronze Age, a network of powerful kingdoms dominated the Near East, including Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, and later Assyria. Rather than engaging in constant warfare, these states often pursued diplomacy through treaties, gift exchanges, and royal intermarriages. Babylon under the Kassites was an active participant in this system. One of the best examples of Kassite diplomacy can be found in the Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets discovered in Egypt. These letters, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time, include correspondence between Kassite kings and Egyptian pharaohs. The letters reveal a world of royal courtesies, negotiations over marriages, exchanges of luxury goods, and discussions of alliances. In one letter, a Kassite king politely reminds the pharaoh to send more gold, noting that the last shipment had been insufficient. These documents show that Babylon remained a respected power, even if no longer militarily dominant. The Kassites also contributed to the material culture of Mesopotamia. They introduced new artistic styles, including distinctive cylinder seals and decorative motifs. Kassite artisans developed new types of pottery and refined existing traditions in metalwork and stone carving. Though few Kassite-era buildings have survived intact, archaeological evidence from sites like Nippur, Babylon, and Dur-Kurigalzu suggests a vibrant and evolving material culture. Religiously, the Kassites made a lasting impact through their devotion to the Babylonian pantheon and their continued development of temple institutions. They restored sacred sites damaged during earlier conflicts and built new temples in provincial cities. The temples functioned not only as places of worship, but also as economic centers, controlling land, managing labor, and redistributing goods. The Kassite period also witnessed the continued importance of scribal education and scholarship. Scribes copied earlier texts and created new works in both Sumerian and Akkadian. Lexical lists, omen collections, and astronomical texts from this era suggest a strong continuity with earlier traditions, even as the language and political structure evolved. The Kassite kings patronized temple schools and supported the preservation of literary and scientific knowledge. Economically, the period appears to have been one of relative stability. Agricultural production supported a growing population, and trade routes were maintained both within Mesopotamia and with neighboring regions. Merchants traded goods such as textiles, grain, metals, and luxury items across the Near East. The standardization of weights and measures, along with the use of silver as a medium of exchange, facilitated commerce and taxation. However, the Kassite era was not without challenges. Periods of drought, local unrest, and border conflicts strained the kingdom. The long rule of the Kassites eventually began to erode under external pressures, particularly from the rising power of Assyria to the north and Elam to the east. In the 12th century BCE, Elamite forces captured Babylon and carried off the famous statue of Marduk, the city's patron god. This event was seen as a symbolic catastrophe and marked the effective end of Kassite rule. Despite their eventual fall, the Kassites left behind a legacy of cultural preservation and political pragmatism. They demonstrated that foreign rulers could adopt and sustain Mesopotamian traditions without undermining local identities. Their reign allowed Babylonian society to recover from the upheaval of the Hittite invasion and to thrive in a new political context. The fall of the Kassite dynasty did not mean the end of Babylon's significance. Even as new dynasties emerged and power shifted once more, the city of Babylon remained a spiritual and cultural center. The next chapters of Mesopotamian history would be shaped by rising empires and new ideologies, but they would do so in the shadow of traditions kept alive during the Kassite centuries. While Babylon remained a center of religious and cultural prestige in southern Mesopotamia, another powerful force was quietly growing in the north. In the region surrounding the upper Tigris River, the city of Ashur emerged as the nucleus of a new kind of Mesopotamian kingdom, one built not just on religion and diplomacy, but on trade, military strength, and administrative discipline. Over the course of centuries, this city-state would evolve into the formidable empire known as Assyria. Assyria began as a modest urban settlement named after its patron god, Ashur. Located along important trade routes near the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq, Ashur had been a religious center since the 3rd millennium BCE. But it was during the early 2nd millennium BCE that it began to develop into a commercial and political power. Unlike Babylon, which grew around priestly and imperial traditions, early Assyria was shaped by its merchant class. One of the earliest phases in Assyrian development is known through the records of the old Assyrian trading colonies. These were not military outposts or imperial provinces, but commercial enclaves established by Assyrian merchants in cities far to the west, most notably in Anatolia. At the heart of this network was the city of Kanesh, modern-day Kultepe in Turkey, where Assyrian merchants lived, traded, and maintained their own houses and legal systems. From the archives of Kanesh, written on thousands of clay tablets, we learn about the sophistication of Assyrian commerce. Merchants shipped tin, textiles, and silver across great distances using donkeys and caravans to navigate the rugged terrain. They kept detailed accounts, wrote contracts, and handled disputes through arbitrators and family councils. These texts reveal a world of long-distance family firms, investment partnerships, and intergenerational business planning. It is among the earliest known examples of an international commercial economy. The Old Assyrian period, roughly from the early to mid-2nd millennium BCE, laid the foundation for later state formation. While the merchants operated independently abroad, they maintained close ties to the homeland and often referred to Ashur with reverence. The king of Ashur at this time was seen not as a divine monarch but as a first among equals, a kind of civic leader who maintained temples, protected trade, and enforced justice. Power was shared with a council of elders and prominent merchants, giving the early Assyrian polity a semi-republican character. However, this system would gradually shift as the needs of the state changed. As Assyria grew in population and economic reach, its leaders began to adopt a more centralized and hierarchical model of governance. This transformation was influenced by both internal developments and external pressures. The political vacuum left by the decline of Babylonian unity and the weakening of surrounding powers allowed Assyria to begin asserting more military control over its region. One of the early rulers to make a mark on Assyrian history was Shamshi-Adad I, who reigned during the early 18th century BCE. Though not originally from Ashur, Shamshi-Adad seized the city and used it as a base to build a short-lived northern empire. He expanded into the Zagros Mountains to the east and down toward the Euphrates in the west, establishing a network of fortresses and garrisons to control key routes and towns. Shamshi-Adad established a complex administrative system with regional governors, military commanders, and royal officials reporting directly to him. His son, Ishme-Dagon, ruled the important city of Ekalatum, helping to manage the western half of the realm. Surviving letters between father and son reveal the king's expectations for discipline, obedience, and loyalty. These texts are among the earliest evidence of centralized bureaucratic rule in northern Mesopotamia. Despite these achievements, Shamshi-Adad's empire did not last long. Upon his death, his territories were quickly contested by rivals, including the rising power of Hammurabi in Babylon. The old Assyrian state reverted to a smaller, regional kingdom centered on Ashur. Still, the memory of Shamshi-Adad's expansive rule would linger, influencing later kings who dreamed of recreating and surpassing his achievements. In the centuries that followed, Assyria maintained its identity through continuity in religious traditions and social structure. The god Ashur remained central to civic life, and temples continued to serve as centers of economic and political power. While Assyria did not yet rival the empires of the south, it preserved its institutions, kept its army trained, and nurtured its administrative skills. The transformation from a merchant city to a military kingdom was not instantaneous. It took time and was shaped by both external threats and internal evolution. Assyria's geographic position gave it both advantages and burdens. It sat at the crossroads of trade routes, but also on the border of highland regions and tribal territories that often posed military challenges. As a result, Assyria became increasingly militarized over time, developing a strong tradition of fortification, discipline, and logistical planning. Another important feature of Assyrian political culture was its approach to kingship. While early kings had shared power with councils, later Assyrian monarchs adopted a more absolute model of rule. The king was seen not only as the earthly representative of Ashur, but as the embodiment of state power. This view of kingship emphasized personal valor, military leadership, and divine favor. Assyrian kings were expected to lead armies in battle, build temples and palaces, and expand the realm through conquest. The transition from the Old Assyrian period to what scholars call the Middle Assyrian period occurred during the later 2nd millennium BCE. During this time, Assyria began to expand its territory more aggressively, challenging the dominance of Babylon, Mitanni, and the Hittite Empire. New laws were introduced, fortresses constructed, and conquered peoples incorporated into the growing state. The Middle Assyrian laws, a set of legal texts from this era, reflect the kingdom's growing centralization and militarization. These laws were stricter and more hierarchical than earlier codes, emphasizing obedience, property rights, and harsh penalties for disloyalty or rebellion. They show a society increasingly focused on order, uniformity, and loyalty to the king. One of the kings responsible for this transformation was Ashurbanipal I, who ruled in the 14th century BCE. He broke Assyria out of its regional limitations and asserted its independence from the fading Mitanni kingdom to the west. Ashurbanipal established diplomatic ties with Egypt, even sending a daughter to marry the pharaoh, a powerful sign of Assyria's rising status in the international system. By the end of the Middle Assyrian period, Assyria had emerged as a major power in the ancient Near East. Its armies were disciplined and well-supplied, its bureaucracy efficient, and its kings ambitious. Yet, this was only the beginning. The full force of Assyrian power would be realized in the coming centuries, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire rose to dominate the entire region. Still, the story of Assyria's early rise is critical to understanding its later greatness. It was forged through trade and tempered by war. Its identity was shaped not just by conquest, but by religious devotion, civic discipline, and cultural continuity. In the next section, we follow the continued expansion of Assyria into the Middle Assyrian period, where the state's early ideals gave way to a more aggressive and imperial vision of power. By the 14th century BCE, Assyria had fully emerged from its earlier status as a regional kingdom and begun transforming into a formidable state. While the Old Assyrian period was marked by commerce and limited territorial ambition, the Middle Assyrian period brought with it a new vision of centralized power, organized military expansion, and increasingly rigid control over society. This was not yet the empire of later centuries, but the foundations were clearly being laid. The transition into the Middle Assyrian period began under Ashurbanipal I, whose reign marked a turning point in Assyrian history. Breaking free from the influence of the Mitanni kingdom to the west, Ashurbanipal expanded Assyrian territory and asserted independence in both military and diplomatic terms. His success in foreign policy is demonstrated in his correspondence with Egypt, found among the Amarna letters, where he styled himself as an equal to the pharaoh and demanded recognition on the international stage. Ashurbanipal's efforts reoriented Assyria from a defensive, trade-focused city-state into a more ambitious military state. He consolidated control over key cities in northern Mesopotamia and began pushing southward into areas traditionally dominated by Babylon. His reign marks the beginning of a pattern that would define the Middle Assyrian state: sustained military campaigns designed to secure trade routes, buffer zones, and tribute-paying vassals. His successors built upon this foundation. Notably, kings like Uruk den Eli and Adad-nirari I expanded Assyrian territory through successive military campaigns. These rulers emphasized battlefield victories, the subjugation of rival cities, and the imposition of tribute. Royal inscriptions from this period are full of phrases declaring that enemy lands were crushed, burned, or brought under the yoke of Ashur. While the style of these proclamations was highly formulaic, it reflects the growing intensity and regularity of military action. One of the most effective Middle Assyrian monarchs was Shalmaneser I, who reigned in the 13th century BCE. He launched successful campaigns against the Hurrians, subjugated the kingdom of Mitanni, and extended Assyrian influence into the upper Euphrates region. These victories gave Assyria control over important trade routes and secured access to valuable resources, including horses, metals, and timber. Shalmaneser I also took a special interest in rebuilding and expanding key cities. He renovated the city of Kalhu, which would later become the capital under the Neo-Assyrian kings, and constructed temples dedicated to Ashur and other major deities. This combination of military conquest and state-sponsored architecture reinforced the divine legitimacy of his rule and symbolized the unification of religion and monarchy in Assyrian ideology. His son and successor, Tukulti-Ninurta I, took Assyrian ambition to new heights. A skilled general and administrator, Tukulti-Ninurta campaigned deeply into Babylonian territory and even captured the city of Babylon itself, a bold move that no previous Assyrian king had accomplished. He claimed the title King of Sumer and Akkad, placing himself in the tradition of past Mesopotamian rulers. This conquest brought immense wealth and prestige, but also provoked resentment among the Babylonians, who viewed the occupation as a violation of their sacred status. Tukulti-Ninurta's reign also reflected growing centralization and religious innovation. He built a new capital called Kar-Tukulti-Ninurta across the Tigris from Ashur, where he erected a large temple to Ashur and housed royal archives and administrative buildings. This act of relocating the center of power, even temporarily, signaled a desire to redefine royal authority apart from traditional institutions. He also left behind one of the earliest known epic poems to celebrate a king's military victories. The Tukulti-Ninurta epic cast the monarch in semi-divine terms and echoed earlier Mesopotamian literary traditions, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. The poem was not merely flattery. It was a tool for shaping public perception and reinforcing the image of the king as divinely guided and victorious. However, Tukulti-Ninurta's reign ended in turmoil. His harsh treatment of Babylon and growing autocracy alienated the priesthood and nobility. He was eventually assassinated by his own son in a palace coup, and Assyria entered a period of instability. Though his military achievements were significant, the cost in political capital was high. Despite this setback, the Middle Assyrian state did not collapse. Later rulers, such as Ashurdan I and Tiglath-Pileser I, restored order and resumed military expansion. Tiglath-Pileser I, in particular, became known for his aggressive campaigns westward into Syria and Anatolia. His inscriptions document the conquest of dozens of cities, the defeat of rebellious vassals, and the capture of vast amounts of tribute. He also made considerable investments in infrastructure. Roads, fortresses, and canals were built or maintained to support military logistics and economic development. The king took pride in his ability to travel rapidly across his realm and to dispatch troops to troubled regions with efficiency, a key feature of Assyrian military doctrine that would later be perfected in the Neo-Assyrian period. One distinctive feature of the Middle Assyrian period was its increasingly detailed administrative and legal systems. The Middle Assyrian laws, a collection of legal texts compiled during this period, show a society deeply concerned with hierarchy, control, and obedience. These laws addressed a wide range of issues: slavery, marriage, property rights, religious obligations, and the duties of officials. They were more severe than earlier codes and emphasized corporal punishment, social stratification, and gender distinctions. For instance, the Middle Assyrian laws imposed strict controls on women, especially in terms of dress, behavior, and legal status. Veiling was regulated, and penalties for adultery or disobedience could be extreme. The laws also detailed punishments for corrupt officials, runaway slaves, and military deserters, highlighting the regime's concern with loyalty and discipline. These developments reflect the ethos of the Middle Assyrian state: highly organized, militarized, and steeped in religious ideology. Kings ruled with the support of a professional bureaucracy, a loyal army, and a priesthood devoted to the national god Ashur. The boundaries between sacred and secular authority were blurred, with the king acting as both high priest and supreme commander. Art and iconography from this period also began to reflect these themes. Royal reliefs depicted kings hunting lions or trampling enemies, images designed to convey dominance, bravery, and divine favor. These motifs would become iconic in later Assyrian art and served to reinforce a culture of power centered on the monarch. By the end of the 12th century BCE, the Middle Assyrian state faced mounting challenges. External pressures from migrating peoples, internal dynastic struggles, and environmental stresses led to a period of decline. However, unlike many Mesopotamian states that collapsed completely, Assyria maintained enough cohesion to survive. It retained a core territory, preserved its administrative systems, and kept alive the traditions that would be revived with devastating effectiveness in the first millennium BCE. In retrospect, the Middle Assyrian period represents a crucial stage in the formation of the Assyrian imperial system. It marked the transition from regional kingdom to proto-empire. It refined the tools of governance, warfare, and ideology that would later be employed on a much larger scale. As the 12th century BCE unfolded, a dramatic and far-reaching transformation spread across the ancient Near East. Empires crumbled, cities were abandoned, trade networks collapsed, and entire civilizations faded into obscurity. This period of upheaval, often referred to as the Late Bronze Age collapse, affected nearly every major power of the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia. While historians continue to debate the causes and sequence of events, there is no doubt that the consequences were profound. In Egypt, the new kingdom declined as internal dissent and external threats destabilized its control over Canaan and Nubia. In Anatolia, the mighty Hittite Empire vanished, its capital Hattusa destroyed and never rebuilt. In the Levant, cities that had flourished for centuries were reduced to ruins. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece fell silent. The Eastern Mediterranean world entered what some have called a dark age. Mesopotamia, while deeply affected, did not collapse in the same dramatic fashion. Instead, it endured this turbulent era through adaptation, resilience, and continuity. The region's survival, however, came at a cost. Its political structures weakened, its trade connections frayed, and its cities entered periods of decline and transformation. To understand how Mesopotamia navigated this crisis, we must first examine the broader context. The Late Bronze Age world was defined by an interconnected system of kingdoms, vassal states, and trade alliances. Goods, such as copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, cedar from Lebanon, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, flowed along routes that crisscrossed the region. Royal courts exchanged letters, gifts, and even brides. A cosmopolitan elite shared styles of dress, weaponry, and religious ideas. But by the end of the 13th century BCE, signs of stress were becoming visible. Climate records indicate prolonged droughts in some areas, which would have reduced crop yields and placed pressure on food supplies. Earthquakes may have destroyed infrastructure and contributed to social chaos. Internal revolts, possibly fueled by inequality or weakened central authority, destabilized palaces and ruling elites. One of the most debated factors is the arrival or movement of peoples from outside the traditional political centers. Among these were the so-called Sea Peoples, whose identity remains uncertain but whose impact was widely felt. These groups attacked coastal cities, disrupted trade routes, and contributed to the downfall of established states. Egyptian inscriptions, including those of Ramses III, describe naval battles against these invaders and portray them as a major threat to regional stability. In Mesopotamia, the effects were less catastrophic but still deeply disruptive. The Kassite dynasty in Babylon, which had ruled for centuries, was increasingly unable to maintain control over its territory. The Elamites from the Iranian plateau took advantage of the weakened state and launched a series of devastating invasions. Around the mid-12th century BCE, Elamite forces captured Babylon, looted its temples, and famously carried off the statue of Marduk, the city's patron god. This symbolic blow undermined the legitimacy of the Kassite kings and marked the end of their dynasty. The fall of the Kassites did not immediately lead to the rise of a new unified regime. Instead, Babylon fell into political fragmentation. A series of short-lived dynasties rose and fell, including the Second Dynasty of Isin and the Sealand Dynasty in the southern marshlands. These kingdoms struggled to maintain order, and written records from this time are sparse compared to earlier periods. The instability of Babylonian politics during this era reflects the broader fragmentation seen across the region. Assyria, too, experienced setbacks. Though it had risen as a powerful state during the Middle Assyrian period, it now faced renewed threats from neighboring peoples, including the Arameans, Semitic-speaking pastoralists, and tribal confederations who began to migrate into the Levant and Upper Mesopotamia. These groups established their own small polities and disrupted traditional urban centers. They also brought with them new patterns of settlement and mobility, which would reshape the demographic and political map of the region. Despite these disruptions, Mesopotamia did not fall into complete collapse. The temple and palace institutions, though weakened, continued to function. Local officials maintained irrigation systems, collected taxes, and upheld religious festivals. Scribes still trained in the ancient texts, and many cities retained at least a modest degree of continuity. One reason for this resilience may lie in the enduring strength of Mesopotamian bureaucracy and tradition. The very depth of its institutional memory, its archives, its ritual calendars, its legal codes, provided a framework that could be adapted even in difficult times. While political power shifted hands, the underlying structures of urban life, literacy, and economic production did not vanish. Another important development of this period was the growing influence of Aramean and Chaldean groups, who would later play a major role in the politics of the first millennium BCE. These groups, though originally peripheral to Mesopotamian civilization, gradually integrated into its systems. They settled in towns, intermarried with local elites, and began to adopt Akkadian language and customs. Over time, they would become key actors in the formation of new dynasties and regional alliances. Economically, the decline of long-distance trade forced cities and regions to become more self-reliant. Local agriculture gained renewed importance, and some evidence suggests a return to smaller-scale craft production. Coinage had not yet developed, but silver continued to serve as a medium of exchange, particularly in bulk transactions. Markets remained active, though on a more localized scale. Culturally, the Late Bronze Age collapse did not erase Mesopotamian identity. Religious practices remained deeply rooted, with the major gods still worshipped in traditional temples. While many literary compositions were no longer copied as frequently, a core canon of texts, especially religious hymns, omens, and rituals, remained in circulation. The act of copying these texts was itself a form of cultural preservation, helping ensure continuity even as political regimes faltered. The disruption of this era also had a paradoxical effect. It cleared the ground for new forms of political organization. In the following centuries, Mesopotamia would see the emergence of Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires, states that drew upon the legacy of the past but innovated in ways suited to new realities. These empires would forge stronger military institutions, more efficient administrative systems, and a sharper ideological vision of kingship. Thus, while the Late Bronze Age collapse brought an end to the old world of powerful monarchs, international diplomacy, and elite cosmopolitanism, it also ushered in a period of adaptation and reinvention. For Mesopotamia, the legacy of writing, law, religion, and urban life proved strong enough to endure and evolve. Out of the instability and fragmentation that followed the Late Bronze Age collapse, a new and fearsome power emerged in northern Mesopotamia. Assyria, having weathered centuries of upheaval and transition, re-emerged with a more aggressive and expansive vision of empire. This marked the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian period, a chapter in Mesopotamian history that would see the rise of one of the most powerful and well-organized military states the ancient world had ever known. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which rose in the early 1st millennium BCE, did not simply rebuild the achievements of the Middle Assyrian period, it redefined them. It transformed the structure of governance, perfected military logistics and strategy, and employed a sophisticated system of propaganda that projected power both at home and abroad. From the 9th century BCE through the late 7th century BCE, Assyria expanded its control across the Near East, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, from the mountains of Iran to the Nile Delta. The foundations for this new phase were laid by kings such as Adad-nirari II, who reigned in the early 9th century BCE. He stabilized the Assyrian heartland, reclaimed lost territories, and began annual campaigns that set a precedent for his successors. With firm control over the Tigris Valley, he established the logistical backbone that allowed for sustained military operations far from home. His successor, Tukulti-Ninurta II, continued this pattern, focusing on the region to the north and west, including incursions into Anatolia. But it was under Ashurbanipal II that Assyria's military ambitions fully came to life. His reign, beginning in the early 9th century BCE, marked the beginning of large-scale imperial conquest and brutal displays of authority. Ashurbanipal II is remembered not only for his military campaigns, but for his calculated use of terror as a political tool. His inscriptions proudly describe the destruction of cities, the flaying of defeated enemies, and the public display of severed heads and bodies. While these acts may seem shocking by modern standards, they were intended to send a clear message. Resistance to Assyrian authority would result in annihilation. This brutal efficiency was coupled with administrative innovation. After conquering a region, Assyrian officials would be installed to govern it, often with local rulers retained under Assyrian oversight. Tribute was demanded in the form of silver, grain, animals, and labor. Roads were maintained or built to allow the rapid movement of troops and officials. Garrisons and provincial centers helped extend the king's reach. Ashurbanipal II also shifted the royal capital from the city of Ashur to Kalhu, modern Nimrud, where he built a grand new palace complex. This move was symbolic of Assyria's transformation from a regional kingdom to an imperial power. His palace walls were decorated with carved reliefs depicting scenes of military triumph, religious ceremony, and the king hunting lions, a powerful symbol of royal dominance. The reign of Shalmaneser III continued the momentum of expansion. His campaigns pushed westward into Syria and the Levant, encountering resistance from coalitions of local kings, including Ahab of Israel. The famous Battle of Karkar, while indecisive, demonstrated the extent of Assyrian influence and the fear it inspired among neighboring rulers. Shalmaneser's long reign saw the development of more complex tribute systems and further integration of conquered territories. However, internal struggles followed his death, and it was not until Tiglath-Pileser III came to power in the mid-8th century BCE that Assyria reached a new peak of efficiency and control. Tiglath-Pileser III was one of the most capable administrators and reformers in Assyrian history. He reorganized the army, creating a standing professional force that could be deployed rapidly and maintained throughout the year. He introduced a new provincial system, replacing semi-autonomous vassals with direct Assyrian rule. His policies allowed for more consistent tax collection, tighter political control, and better integration of diverse populations. His conquests reached into Syria, Israel, and parts of Iran. When resistance arose, he responded with overwhelming force. Entire populations were deported and resettled in different regions of the empire, a tactic designed to prevent rebellion and encourage loyalty. These mass deportations were carefully organized and recorded in royal inscriptions and administrative archives. The reigns of his successors, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, built upon these reforms and continued the drive for expansion. Sargon II's reign marked the capture of Samaria and the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. He also led campaigns into Anatolia, Urartu, and Elam, reinforcing Assyria's dominance across the region. Sennacherib, one of the most well-documented Neo-Assyrian kings, moved the capital to Nineveh and undertook massive building projects, including the construction of canals, palaces, and defensive walls. He is also known for his siege of Jerusalem, described both in Assyrian records and in the Hebrew Bible. While the city was not captured, the campaign demonstrated Assyria's reach into the southern Levant. His rule also saw one of the most controversial acts in Assyrian history, the destruction of Babylon. After a rebellion, Sennacherib ordered the city razed, its temples desecrated, and its people punished. This act shocked even his own people, who had long respected Babylon as a cultural and religious center. Sennacherib's violent response to Babylonian defiance would cast a long shadow over his legacy. Under the Neo-Assyrian kings, the empire reached its greatest extent. Esarhaddon, son of Sennacherib, not only restored Babylon, but launched a successful campaign into Egypt, briefly incorporating it into the empire. His son, Ashurbanipal, presided over an empire that stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the highlands of western Iran. Ashurbanipal is also famous for his intellectual pursuits. He established a vast royal library in Nineveh, collecting thousands of clay tablets that included literary, legal, scientific, and religious texts. Among them was the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, known today. His reign marked both the high point of Assyrian power and a cultural renaissance. Yet, even at its zenith, the Neo-Assyrian Empire faced deepening strains. The sheer size of the empire made it difficult to manage. Continuous military campaigns drained resources and manpower. Rebellions flared in distant provinces. The brutality that had once ensured compliance now bred resentment and resistance. By the end of the 7th century BCE, cracks began to appear. Internal dynastic struggles, external invasions by Medes and Babylonians, and widespread revolts combined to bring the empire down. Within a few decades, Nineveh itself would fall, and the great empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries would vanish. But the legacy of the Neo-Assyrian Empire endured. It set a new standard for imperial organization, warfare, and governance. Its art and architecture influenced future cultures, and its administrative practices were emulated by later empires, including the Babylonians and Persians. As the Neo-Assyrian Empire surged to the height of its power, a defining figure stepped into the spotlight: Sennacherib, the son of Sargon II. His reign, beginning in the late 8th century BCE, was marked by military strength, monumental architecture, and a deeply controversial decision that would leave a lasting scar on Mesopotamian history: the destruction of Babylon. Sennacherib inherited a vast and increasingly complex empire. His father, Sargon II, had expanded Assyrian control into the Levant, Anatolia, and parts of Iran. He had also fought to maintain Assyrian authority in the rebellious southern region of Babylonia. Yet when Sennacherib assumed the throne, the challenge of Babylon remained unresolved. Babylon, long revered as a center of culture, religion, and history, had become both a prized possession and a persistent thorn in the side of Assyrian kings. Though nominally under Assyrian control, the city was often a center of resistance. Its elite priesthood, strong civic identity, and proud traditions made it difficult to rule from afar. Babylon's complex religious politics, including the reverence for its patron god Marduk, made any military action there particularly sensitive. Early in his reign, Sennacherib faced a major uprising in Babylon. The rebellion was led by a powerful Chaldean prince named Marduk-apla-iddina, also known in biblical texts as Merodach-Baladan. This seasoned opponent had already ruled Babylon once before and now returned with the support of Elamite forces from the east. He seized control of Babylon and declared independence from Assyria. Sennacherib responded with characteristic force. He launched a series of campaigns to reclaim Babylon and crush the rebellion. In time, he succeeded in defeating Marduk-apla-iddina and regaining control of the city. But the cycle of revolt and repression continued. Each time Assyrian forces withdrew, new uprisings erupted. For Sennacherib, the problem of Babylon became a source of ongoing instability and growing frustration. Eventually, he made a decision that broke with the traditional Assyrian policy of religious tolerance and cultural reverence. In a move that shocked the ancient world, Sennacherib ordered the complete destruction of Babylon. The city's walls were torn down, its temples looted, and the statue of Marduk, normally a symbol of legitimacy and divine favor, was taken or desecrated. The canals that sustained the city's agriculture were deliberately diverted, flooding Babylon and turning it into a desolate swamp. Sennacherib's inscriptions leave no doubt about the thoroughness of this act. He wrote that he swept away the city like a hurricane and made its destruction more complete than that by a flood. He portrayed the decision as divinely sanctioned, claiming that Ashur, the god of Assyria, had commanded him to destroy the city for its disobedience and blasphemy. The destruction of Babylon was unprecedented in Mesopotamian history. While cities had been conquered, sacked, and punished before, Babylon held a unique place in the cultural imagination of the region. Even previous Assyrian kings who had defeated the city had refrained from damaging its temples. Babylon was not just another urban center, it was a symbol of continuity, legitimacy, and sacred tradition. The reaction to Sennacherib's actions was one of widespread condemnation, even among Assyrians. The priesthood and much of the population considered the destruction of Babylon a sacrilege. To many, Sennacherib's offense was not merely political, but cosmic, a violation of divine balance. This perception may have contributed to growing unrest at home and within the court. Ironically, while Sennacherib's military campaigns were often successful, it is the destruction of Babylon that became the defining act of his reign. His legacy, preserved in inscriptions and echoed in later texts, is forever linked to this moment of violence and impiety. Outside of Babylonia, Sennacherib's reign was marked by continued military activity. He led campaigns against the kingdoms of the Levant, including Judah. The biblical account in the Book of Kings describes how Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem during the reign of King Hezekiah. While the Assyrian annals boast of capturing fortified cities and forcing tribute from Hezekiah, they notably do not claim to have taken Jerusalem itself, a fact that has intrigued scholars for generations. Sennacherib also devoted immense resources to architectural projects. Having moved the royal capital from Calhu to Nineveh, he embarked on a massive building campaign to transform the city into a model of Assyrian power. He constructed a new palace known as the Palace Without Rival, filled with carved stone reliefs depicting royal hunts, military victories, and ceremonial processions. These artworks were not mere decoration, they were ideological tools, broadcasting messages of dominance and divine favor. One of Sennacherib's most ambitious engineering feats was the construction of an extensive canal system to bring water into Nineveh from distant mountains. The canals included aqueducts, tunnels, and dams, a remarkable example of hydraulic engineering. The increased water supply supported the city's population and allowed for lush gardens, some of which may have inspired the later legends of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Despite his accomplishments, Sennacherib's rule ended in tragedy. In a dramatic reversal of his own ruthlessness, he was assassinated in the Temple of Ninurta by two of his sons. Ancient sources suggest that his death may have been the result of internal court politics and discontent over his religious policies, particularly the destruction of Babylon. His successor, Esarhaddon, took the throne after a brief power struggle and sought to reverse some of his father's decisions. One of his first acts was to rebuild Babylon. He initiated a campaign of reconciliation, restoring temples, returning the statue of Marduk, and issuing decrees that emphasized respect for Babylonian traditions. In doing so, he acknowledged the deep damage his father's actions had caused, not just to the city, but to the ideological foundation of Assyrian kingship. The story of Sennacherib and Babylon encapsulates the contradictions of Assyrian imperialism: unmatched military power paired with cultural fragility, administrative brilliance undermined by acts of brutal excess. His reign reveals both the strength and the vulnerabilities of empire at its peak. As the Neo-Assyrian Empire approached its zenith, one ruler would leave an enduring legacy not only as a military leader but as one of the most learned kings in ancient history. Ashurbanipal, the grandson of Sennacherib and the son of Esarhaddon, ascended the throne in the 7th century BCE. His reign marked the final peak of Assyrian power, cultural influence, and administrative reach. Yet what most distinguishes Ashurbanipal in the historical record is not only the scale of his conquests, but the intellectual ambition that culminated in the establishment of the royal library of Nineveh. Ashurbanipal was not the first in his dynasty to value knowledge, but he pursued it with a rare personal passion. Unlike most Mesopotamian kings, Ashurbanipal was fully literate. He was trained from an early age by scribes and priests in both Akkadian and the older Sumerian languages. He could read and write cuneiform, a rare accomplishment even among elites, and prided himself on his understanding of rituals, mathematics, astrology, and religious texts. This intellectual background shaped the way Ashurbanipal governed. He saw knowledge as a source of power, not only for religious and administrative purposes, but as a means of preserving and asserting cultural dominance. Through the collection and copying of texts, Ashurbanipal aimed to unify the knowledge of the ancient world under Assyrian control. To that end, he ordered scribes to gather texts from across the empire. Clay tablets were collected from temples, palaces, and libraries in cities such as Babylon, Nippur, Uruk, and Susa. When regions were conquered, their archives were not merely looted, they were incorporated into the growing royal library. In some cases, scribes made copies of fragile or rare documents. In others, they cataloged entire archives. The goal was clear: to preserve all significant works of Mesopotamian thought, ritual, and history within Nineveh. The result was the Library of Ashurbanipal, a vast and carefully organized collection housed within the palace complex at Nineveh. The library contained thousands of clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform, covering a remarkable range of subjects: literature, religion, law, science, medicine, divination, and astronomy. Cataloging tablets, colophons, and shelving systems indicate a high degree of organization, resembling the practices of later institutional libraries. Among the most famous texts recovered from the Library of Nineveh is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The version found in Ashurbanipal's collection is the most complete copy known today, and includes the well-known flood narrative, the story of Enkidu, and Gilgamesh's search for immortality. The presence of such literature in the royal library shows that Ashurbanipal valued not only administrative records and religious texts, but also cultural memory and storytelling. The library also preserved omen texts used in divination, such as the Enuma Anu Enlil, a collection of celestial omens, and the Barutu, a guide to liver divination. These were not mere curiosities. They played a vital role in statecraft. Assyrian kings consulted diviners and astrologers before launching military campaigns or undertaking major political decisions. Ashurbanipal's commitment to preserving such texts ensured that future generations of priests and scholars could continue these practices. Yet Ashurbanipal was not merely a scholar king, he was also a formidable military leader. During his reign, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. He launched campaigns into Egypt, defeating the Nubian rulers who had controlled the region and briefly re-establishing Assyrian authority over the Nile Valley. He subdued rebellions in Phoenicia and Palestine, asserting dominance over the western provinces of the empire. One of Ashurbanipal's most significant military conflicts was with Elam, a long-standing rival to Assyria. Over a series of campaigns, he decisively defeated the Elamites, capturing their cities, destroying their temples, and deporting much of their population. In a dramatic display of triumph, he brought back the head of the Elamite king Tumen and displayed it in Nineveh. The fall of Elam effectively removed a major eastern threat and further demonstrated the power of the Assyrian war machine. Ashurbanipal's correspondence and inscriptions paint a picture of a king deeply involved in both administration and warfare. Letters between the king and his officials reveal a ruler who was demanding, exacting, and deeply concerned with order. He monitored grain shipments, troop movements, and temple rituals with equal intensity. He expected obedience, efficiency, and loyalty, and did not hesitate to punish failure. Despite these strengths, the seeds of decline were beginning to take root during his reign. The sheer size of the empire required constant military intervention. Rebellions became more frequent, particularly in the southern regions of Babylonia. One of the most dangerous uprisings came from within Ashurbanipal's own family. His brother, Shamash-Shumukin, who had been installed as king of Babylon in a gesture of dynastic cooperation, eventually turned against him. The resulting civil war was long and brutal. Shamash-Shumukin allied with Elam and other disaffected powers, leading a broad coalition against Assyria. Ashurbanipal responded with devastating force. Babylon was besieged and the rebellion crushed. While the city itself was spared the fate it had suffered under Sennacherib, the war strained the empire's resources and deepened internal divisions. After defeating his brother, Ashurbanipal turned his attention to consolidating power. He continued to patronize temples, build infrastructure, and expand the royal library. However, by the end of his reign, signs of overextension were clear. Provincial governors wielded increasing autonomy. The loyalty of vassal states grew uncertain. The Aramaic language, already widespread, began to replace Akkadian in daily use, reflecting shifting cultural dynamics within the empire. Ashurbanipal's death, around the close of the 7th century BCE, marked the beginning of the end for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. His successors lacked his authority and vision. The carefully maintained systems of control began to unravel. External enemies sensed weakness, and internal factions vied for dominance. The Library of Nineveh, once a monument to order and knowledge, would eventually be buried in the ruins of the city after its fall. Ironically, it was this destruction that ensured its survival. The clay tablets, protected by the collapsed walls and roofs of the palace, remained intact beneath the rubble for more than 2,000 years until their excavation in the 19th century. Today, the library stands as one of Ashurbanipal's greatest achievements and one of the most valuable archaeological discoveries in Mesopotamian history. Its contents have shaped modern understanding of ancient religion, science, and literature. Through the tablets he preserved, Ashurbanipal extended his legacy far beyond his lifetime, even as the empire he ruled collapsed soon after his death. As the 7th century BCE drew to a close, the mighty Neo-Assyrian Empire began to falter. Though it had once controlled vast territories across the Near East, stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, the same ambition and military dominance that fueled its expansion also sowed the seeds of its collapse. Exhaustion from constant warfare, overextension of administrative resources, internal rebellion, and the rise of new powers all converged in a series of events that brought Assyria to its knees. The empire that had terrified and commanded the ancient world for centuries would soon vanish from the political stage. The death of Ashurbanipal, Assyria's last great king, marked the beginning of the end. Although his reign had seen the empire reach its cultural and territorial peak, it had also exposed its structural weaknesses. After his passing, around the final decade of the 7th century BCE, the empire rapidly descended into instability. His immediate successors, likely including Ashur-etil-ilani and Sin-shar-ishkun, were unable to maintain the unity and control that Ashurbanipal had enforced with such diligence. The first cracks appeared within the heart of the empire. Civil wars broke out, particularly in the core cities of northern Mesopotamia, as factions struggled for power. Without a strong central authority, provincial governors and military commanders became increasingly autonomous. Some turned against the central government entirely, while others simply ceased to follow orders. This internal fragmentation made it difficult to respond effectively to growing threats on the borders. One of the most significant threats came from the east. The Medes, an Iranian people from the Zagros Mountains, had been gradually organizing into a more cohesive kingdom. Once dominated by Assyrian power, they now saw an opportunity to strike back. Under the leadership of King Cyaxares, the Medes began attacking Assyrian outposts and towns. Their aggression was more than opportunistic. It was strategic, aimed at dismantling the empire piece by piece. At the same time, a new force was rising in southern Mesopotamia. The Chaldeans, a Semitic people who had long lived in the marshlands near the Persian Gulf, began to assert political authority under the leadership of Nabopolassar. He emerged from the power vacuum in Babylon, where resentment toward Assyrian rule had simmered for decades. In a bold move, Nabopolassar declared independence from Assyria and crowned himself king of Babylon. The Chaldeans and the Medes soon formed a powerful alliance. Though from different regions and cultural traditions, both shared a common enemy. Their joint strategy was clear: to destroy the Assyrian heartland and eliminate the empire once and for all. This coalition would prove devastatingly effective. The first major blow came with the fall of Assur, the ancient capital and religious center of Assyria. In a campaign led by the Medes around the year 614 BCE, the city was attacked and captured. Though no longer the political capital, Assur still held deep symbolic significance. Its fall sent shockwaves across the region and demonstrated that the empire was truly vulnerable. The coalition forces then turned their attention to Nineveh, the glittering capital built up by Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal. For decades, Nineveh had symbolized Assyrian power with its massive walls, grand palaces, and monumental temples. In the year 612 BCE, after a prolonged siege, the city fell. The Medes and Babylonians breached its defenses, and what followed was complete devastation. Ancient sources, including later Babylonian chronicles, describe the destruction of Nineveh in vivid terms. The city was looted and burned, its palaces destroyed, its temples desecrated. Those who survived the fighting were killed, enslaved, or scattered. The loss of Nineveh marked not just the fall of a capital, but the end of an era. Some remnants of the Assyrian state held out in the west. A surviving general named Ashurbanipal II attempted to rally forces in the city of Haran, hoping to maintain some fragment of the empire. But even this final effort was doomed. In a coordinated campaign, the Medes and Babylonians attacked Haran and seized it. Assyrian resistance collapsed, and by the end of the first decade of the 6th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire was no more. What makes the fall of Assyria particularly striking is the speed and totality of its collapse. Within a generation, the most powerful empire in the Near East disappeared, leaving behind only ruins, records, and memories. The reasons for its downfall are many and interlinked. Internal succession crises, economic exhaustion, harsh treatment of vassal states, failure to maintain alliances, and the rise of well-organized enemies. The fall of Assyria also reshaped the political map of the ancient Near East. The Medes secured control over parts of northern Mesopotamia and Iran, while the Chaldean dynasty in Babylon, under Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar II, inherited the mantle of Mesopotamian leadership. A new era was beginning, one that would see the resurgence of Babylon as a cultural and political force. Culturally, the end of Assyria did not mean the end of Assyrian influence. The cities, laws, administrative systems, and artistic styles it had developed continued to echo in the regions it once controlled. Babylonian scribes preserved Assyrian texts, and later empires learned from its models of governance. Yet politically, Assyria was finished. No Assyrian state would rise again to dominate the region. The memory of Assyria endured in different ways. In the Hebrew Bible, Assyria was remembered both as a scourge and a tool of divine justice, especially for its role in the conquest of Israel. In Greek and later Roman writings, it was portrayed as the archetype of ancient tyranny and splendor. In modern times, the rediscovery of Assyrian ruins, inscriptions, and art has reawakened interest in a civilization whose impact was once feared and now admired. The fall of Assyria teaches a broader lesson about imperial power, that even the mightiest states are vulnerable to collapse when they overreach, mistreat their subjects, or fail to adapt. It also highlights the resilience of cultural memory, how the achievements of a vanished empire can continue to influence those that follow. With the final destruction of Assyria in the early 6th century BCE, the political landscape of Mesopotamia shifted decisively. Rising from the wreckage of a shattered imperial order was the Chaldean-led Neo-Babylonian Empire, often referred to as the last great native Mesopotamian state. This new Babylonian kingdom was more than a successor to earlier southern dynasties. It was a cultural and political rebirth, grounded in traditional Mesopotamian identity, yet forged through new leadership and geopolitical ambition. The founder of this dynasty was Nabopolassar, a Chaldean tribal leader who rose to prominence during the final decades of Assyrian power. A skilled military commander and shrewd politician, Nabopolassar capitalized on Assyria's internal instability and formed an alliance with the Medes. This coalition delivered the final blows to Assyria, capturing key cities like Assur and Nineveh, and eventually wiping out the last Assyrian holdouts in Haran. With the empire of his former overlords dismantled, Nabopolassar turned to consolidating power in Babylonia. He established himself not just as a king, but as a restorer of order. He repaired damaged temples, reinstated religious ceremonies, and positioned Babylon as the spiritual and political center of the New Age. His reign set the tone for what would become the Neo-Babylonian period, an era defined by revival, construction, and renewed cultural pride. Nabopolassar's rule lasted for roughly 2 decades, and upon his death, the throne passed to his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. It is under Nebuchadnezzar that the Neo-Babylonian Empire would reach the height of its power, sophistication, and fame. His name would become synonymous with Babylon's glory and its complex legacy. Nebuchadnezzar II inherited both opportunity and responsibility. With Assyria gone and Egypt weakened after its failed intervention in the Levant, he faced no major imperial rivals. Yet the stability of his new empire depended on securing its borders, controlling its rebellious vassals, and asserting authority over the western territories, including Phoenicia, Judah, and parts of Syria. Early in his reign, Nebuchadnezzar launched military campaigns westward. He defeated the Egyptian forces at the Battle of Carchemish and took control of key cities along the Mediterranean coast. These victories expanded Babylonian influence into regions that had long been contested between Assyria and Egypt. The conquest of Judah, which culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem and the deportation of the Jewish elite to Babylon, a period known as the Babylonian exile, remains one of the most widely remembered episodes from his reign. However, Nebuchadnezzar's fame was not built solely on military conquest. His most enduring achievements were architectural and cultural. He undertook a massive program of urban renewal and temple reconstruction in Babylon, transforming the city into one of the most impressive capitals of the ancient world. His projects included the reinforcement of city walls, the expansion of the royal palace, and the restoration of the great temples, especially the Esagila, dedicated to Marduk. Under his patronage, Babylon became a city of immense grandeur. The processional street, paved with stone and lined with lions in glazed brick relief, led to the famous Ishtar Gate. A monumental entryway decorated in brilliant blue tiles and adorned with dragons and bulls representing the gods Marduk and Adad. The Ishtar Gate became a symbol of imperial power and religious devotion, and it would remain iconic long after Babylon's decline. Among the most famous structures attributed to Nebuchadnezzar's reign is the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Although their exact location and even their historical reality remain debated by modern scholars, classical writers described them as a terraced garden complex of astonishing beauty, built according to tradition to please a homesick queen from the mountainous region of Media. The gardens supposedly featured exotic plants, artificial irrigation, and soaring architecture. Whether or not they existed as described, the legend reflects the awe Babylon inspired in the ancient imagination. Nebuchadnezzar also placed great emphasis on maintaining Babylon's religious institutions. He reinforced the dominance of Marduk in the state pantheon and oversaw the elaborate New Year festival, which symbolized the king's connection to the gods and his legitimacy as ruler. During this festival, the statue of Marduk was ceremonially paraded from the Esagila to a nearby temple, while the king underwent a ritual of humility and reaffirmation of divine favor. Administratively, Nebuchadnezzar continued many practices inherited from earlier Mesopotamian states. He relied on a network of provincial governors and scribes, enforced tribute from subject cities, and maintained official archives to track tax collection, legal rulings, and temple activity. The empire's bureaucracy functioned efficiently, enabling centralized control over a diverse population. Economically, the Neo-Babylonian Empire benefited from a combination of local agriculture, long-distance trade, and state-sponsored building projects. Grain, dates, and livestock were produced in abundance along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Trade with Arabia, Anatolia, and the Persian Gulf brought luxury goods such as incense, metals, and textiles. Royal records mention large-scale transactions, indicating a vibrant commercial life fueled by both internal demand and international connections. Despite these strengths, Nebuchadnezzar's successors struggled to maintain the empire's stability after his death. His son, Amel-Marduk, reigned briefly and was followed by a succession of kings whose legitimacy and effectiveness were increasingly questioned. The Chaldean dynasty lost coherence, and internal court intrigues weakened central authority. At the same time, a new threat was growing in the east. The Persian kingdom, under the leadership of Cyrus of Anshan, was expanding rapidly. The Medes, once allies of the Babylonians, were conquered by the Persians, bringing much of the Iranian plateau under Cyrus's control. His campaigns were calculated and swift, and his reputation for clemency and strategic brilliance spread quickly. In Babylon, the last Neo-Babylonian king, Nabonidus, took the throne. His reign was marked by religious and political controversy. Unlike his predecessors, Nabonidus favored the moon god Sin over Marduk, disrupting traditional temple activities and alienating the priesthood in Babylon. He also spent many years in the Arabian oasis of Tema, leaving the capital in the hands of his son, Belshazzar. This unusual behavior, combined with military setbacks and administrative tension, weakened the legitimacy of his rule. When Cyrus of Persia turned his attention to Babylon, he faced little effective resistance. Many within the empire, including members of the priesthood and segments of the aristocracy, welcomed him as a liberator. In the year 539 BCE, Persian forces entered Babylon without major conflict. Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order and piety. He paid homage to Marduk, restored temples, and allowed exiled peoples, such as the Jews, to return to their homelands. With this, the Neo-Babylonian Empire came to an end. Its fall was not marked by fire and ruin, but by political transition and the beginning of a new era under Persian rule. Yet its legacy was far from extinguished. The Neo-Babylonian period had revived the cultural and architectural glory of ancient Mesopotamia. It reinforced the idea of Babylon as a center of wisdom, religious authority, and monumental grandeur, Through the works of scribes, builders, priests, and kings, the final chapter of native Mesopotamian civilization left a deep imprint on history. Among the many kings who ruled Mesopotamia across its long and storied history, few names have endured with as much power and mystique as Nebuchadnezzar II. His reign during the early 6th century BCE marks the high point of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the final flowering of Mesopotamian civilization under native rule. While earlier kings had conquered, codified laws, or founded empires, Nebuchadnezzar left behind a legacy defined by towering architecture, calculated diplomacy, and a reputation that spanned cultural, religious, and historical traditions. Nebuchadnezzar II was the son of Nabopolassar, the Chaldean leader who had risen to power in Babylon during the decline of the Assyrian Empire. When Nabopolassar died, Nebuchadnezzar was already an experienced military commander. He had led Babylonian armies to decisive victories, most notably at the Battle of Carchemish against Egypt, which secured control of Syria and the Levant for Babylon and eliminated Egypt's influence from those regions. Upon taking the throne, Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention to the consolidation and expansion of Babylon's imperial power. His military campaigns continued throughout his reign, aimed at maintaining dominance over rebellious vassal states and asserting Babylonian supremacy in contested regions. One of the most consequential of these campaigns involved the Kingdom of Judah. In response to repeated uprisings and alliances with Egypt, Nebuchadnezzar launched military operations against Jerusalem. The first resulted in the city's partial submission and the deportation of members of its royal family and elite. When rebellion erupted again, Nebuchadnezzar returned. In a decisive and brutal act, he destroyed the city's walls, looted the Temple of Solomon, and exiled much of the population to Babylon. This event, known as the Babylonian exile, had a profound impact on the Jewish people and is remembered as a pivotal episode in biblical history. Nebuchadnezzar's interactions with Jerusalem and Judah have contributed significantly to his portrayal in later Judeo-Christian texts. In the Hebrew Bible, he is depicted as both an agent of divine judgment and a tyrant. The Book of Daniel presents him as a proud king who undergoes a dramatic humbling, while the Book of Kings focuses on the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile. These portrayals shape the enduring image of Nebuchadnezzar in Western tradition, often as a symbol of hubris and divine retribution. Yet, within his own realm, Nebuchadnezzar was celebrated as a restorer, protector, and patron of the gods. His inscriptions emphasize his devotion to Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, and his efforts to beautify and strengthen the city in honor of the divine. He styled himself not only as a warrior king, but also as a servant of the gods tasked with rebuilding and maintaining sacred structures. Nowhere is Nebuchadnezzar's legacy more visible than in the physical transformation of Babylon during his reign. He undertook an extensive program of construction that reshaped the city's landscape and elevated it to the status of a world capital. Central to this vision was the rebuilding of the Asagala, the great temple complex dedicated to Marduk, and the Atemananki, a massive ziggurat that may have inspired later stories of the Tower of Babel. The Atemananki, meaning House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, stood at the heart of Babylon's religious life. It was a multi-tiered tower constructed of baked bricks and rising to impressive heights. Though its exact measurements and form remain uncertain due to later damage, ancient sources describe it as one of the most magnificent religious structures in the region. It symbolized the connection between heaven and earth and the divine order upheld by the Babylonian king. Nebuchadnezzar also reinforced and expanded the walls surrounding Babylon. These massive defensive structures, built from mud brick and faced with kiln-fired bricks, protected the city and demonstrated its power. The double wall system, with inner and outer fortifications separated by a moat, was both functional and symbolic. It marked Babylon as an impregnable center of civilization and culture. Among the most celebrated elements of Nebuchadnezzar's building works was the processional way, a broad paved street that passed through the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate itself, decorated with vibrant blue-glazed bricks and reliefs of lions, dragons, and bulls, was one of the most iconic entrances in the ancient world. It served as a ceremonial route for religious festivals, particularly the New Year celebration, when the statue of Marduk was paraded through the city in ritual procession. This careful orchestration of space, architecture, and ritual functioned as more than civic infrastructure. It was an expression of cosmic order. Every element of the city, from its gates to its temples to its ziggurats, was meant to mirror the divine plan. By maintaining and expanding Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar positioned himself as a steward of that order. Though modern historians still debate the existence of the famed Hanging Gardens of Babylon, many ancient writers, including the Greek historians Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, attributed them to Nebuchadnezzar's reign. These sources describe terraced gardens planted with trees and flowers, watered by an ingenious irrigation system, and constructed to mimic the mountainous landscape of a queen's homeland, possibly his Median wife. If the Hanging Gardens did exist as described, they would have represented a remarkable feat of engineering, combining aesthetic beauty with practical design. Whether real or mythologized, they reflect the aura of wonder that surrounded Babylon in the classical imagination and Nebuchadnezzar's association with grand, visionary projects. Beyond his military and architectural achievements, Nebuchadnezzar also left behind a legacy in administration and cultural continuity. Like earlier Mesopotamian rulers, he maintained a bureaucracy of scribes, governors, and temple officials. He funded the continuation of traditional literature, supported astronomical research, and ensured the preservation of religious rituals and calendar observances. Under his rule, Babylonian cuneiform culture continued to thrive, even as Aramaic gained popularity as the spoken language of daily life. The empire's diverse population, including deportees from conquered territories, lived in a dynamic urban society where economic activity, religious practice, and civic life were deeply intertwined. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for over 4 decades, a period of relative stability and prosperity. Upon his death, however, the empire quickly lost its cohesion. His immediate successors lacked his authority and vision, and the throne passed through several rulers in quick succession, including his son Amel-Marduk and later Nabonidus, whose controversial policies further alienated parts of the population and the priesthood. Nonetheless, Nebuchadnezzar's reign remains the most illustrious period of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. His achievements elevated Babylon to its legendary status, and his reputation endured long after the empire's fall. In biblical, classical, and later Islamic and Christian writings, his name became a reference point for discussions about divine kingship, pride, justice, and the rise and fall of empires. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, under Nebuchadnezzar II, had reached its pinnacle in political power, architectural splendor, and cultural prestige. But in the years that followed his death, the empire began to lose its cohesion. Babylon's final century as an independent power was marked by dynastic instability, shifting alliances, and a growing threat from the east. That threat came in the form of the rising Persian Empire, led by one of antiquity's most formidable figures, Cyrus the Great. After Nebuchadnezzar's long and effective reign, the transition of power was anything but smooth. His son Amel-Marduk ruled briefly before being overthrown by his brother-in-law Neriglissar, who ruled for only a few years. Neriglissar was followed by his young son, who was soon deposed, and then Nabonidus, a figure whose reign would prove both controversial and transformative. Nabonidus was not a member of the established royal line, but seems to have been a high-ranking court official or governor before taking the throne. His rise to power marked a departure from previous Chaldean rulers, and his reign was marked by unconventional decisions that caused tensions within Babylonian society. One of Nabonidus's most significant and puzzling choices was his elevation of the moon god Sin to a position of preeminence, seemingly above the traditional chief deity Marduk. He promoted Sin's cult, especially in the city of Haran, and even neglected the Akidu festival. the annual New Year celebration that honored Marduk and symbolized the king's divine legitimacy. This shift deeply upset the powerful priesthood of Marduk in Babylon and alienated large segments of the population. Perhaps more disruptive still was Nabonidus's prolonged absence from the capital. For reasons still debated by historians, he departed Babylon and spent roughly a decade living in the distant Arabian oasis of Tema. During this time, he left his son Belshazzar in charge of Babylon. Belshazzar is remembered in later biblical tradition for hosting a lavish banquet during which a mysterious inscription appeared on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, interpreted by the prophet Daniel as a divine warning of Babylon's impending fall. While the court in Babylon struggled with religious and political divisions, events in the east were unfolding with astonishing speed. Cyrus, the ruler of the Persian tribe of Anshan in southwestern Iran, had begun to challenge the authority of the Median Empire. In a series of swift campaigns, he overthrew the Median king Astyages and absorbed his territories. This consolidation of Persian and Median lands marked the birth of the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus proved to be more than a conqueror. He was a statesman and strategist. He built alliances, respected local traditions, and earned a reputation for clemency toward defeated peoples. His rule over former Median lands was largely peaceful, and he quickly turned his attention westward toward Lydia in Anatolia and, eventually, Babylon itself. Babylon at this time remained a formidable power. Its walls were high, its temples active, and its wealth renowned. However, the empire's internal divisions made it vulnerable. Many of its provinces, particularly in the western territories, had become disillusioned with Babylonian rule. The unpopular reign of Nabonidus created further openings for Cyrus to exploit. In the year 539 BCE, Cyrus launched his campaign against Babylon. The Persian army moved steadily westward, encountering minimal resistance. Several key cities, including Sippar, surrendered without battle. The weakening support for Nabonidus among the elite and priesthood meant that Cyrus's forces were often welcomed rather than opposed. The final act came with the entry of Persian forces into the city of Babylon itself. Ancient sources suggest that the conquest was achieved with little bloodshed. According to the Babylonian Chronicle, a cuneiform tablet detailing these events, Cyrus's general Gobryas entered Babylon peacefully, and soon after, Cyrus himself arrived and was accepted as king. Nabonidus was captured, but no mass reprisals followed. The city's temples were respected, its gods honored, and its institutions allowed to continue under new oversight. Cyrus's policy of religious tolerance and cultural diplomacy helped him consolidate his rule. He restored cults that had been suppressed, including that of Marduk, and presented himself as the chosen liberator of Babylon. He returned captured idols to their native cities, permitted displaced peoples to return to their homelands, and issued proclamations affirming his legitimacy. One of the most famous such declarations is the Cyrus Cylinder, an inscription that outlines his policies and portrays him as a just and divinely favored ruler. The fall of Babylon marked the end of nearly 2,000 years of native Mesopotamian rule. From the time of the earliest Sumerian city-states to the grandeur of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Mesopotamia had been governed by its own peoples, with their own languages, religious institutions, and legal traditions. With the Persian conquest, that era came to a close. Yet Persian rule in Mesopotamia was not one of cultural erasure. The Achaemenid kings allowed temples to continue their operations and retained many elements of Mesopotamian administration. Local governors or satraps managed regions with relative autonomy, and scribes continued to use Akkadian cuneiform for official documents. The region remained a vital part of the empire's infrastructure and economy, serving as a bridge between the east and west of the growing Persian realm. However, the symbolic independence of Babylon was gone. No longer a center of imperial decision-making, it became one province among many. Over the next centuries, under successive empires, Persian, Greek, Parthian, and Roman, the traditions of Mesopotamia would gradually fade, absorbed or replaced by new cultural and religious systems. Still, the memory of Babylon lingered. Its name became synonymous with grandeur, wisdom, and, at times, decadence. In biblical texts, it was a place of exile and moral warning. In Greek writings, it was a marvel of architecture and scholarship. And in modern archaeology, it became one of the most evocative and revealing sites for understanding the ancient world. The fall of Babylon to Cyrus was not merely a change in political control. It was a transformation in the very idea of empire in the ancient world. Whereas earlier Mesopotamian empires often ruled through fear and conquest, Cyrus introduced a model based on integration, tolerance, and administrative sophistication. That model would influence imperial ideology for centuries to come. With the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great, the long arc of independent Mesopotamian civilization came to an end. Yet the influence of Mesopotamia did not vanish. Far from fading into silence, the cultural, intellectual, and institutional legacies of this region endured, shaping the development of the ancient world and beyond. In this final section, we explore how the foundational ideas and innovations of Mesopotamia continued to ripple through history, transforming later empires, informing religious traditions, and providing the roots of many aspects of modern society. Mesopotamia's most enduring contribution is arguably the invention of writing. The earliest known writing system, cuneiform, was developed by Sumerian scribes in the late 4th millennium BCE. Initially created to track agricultural goods and temple offerings, it soon evolved into a sophisticated tool for administration, law, literature, and science. Over the centuries, cuneiform adapted to record multiple languages, including Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian. Even after cuneiform ceased to be used in daily life, its intellectual framework, systematic record-keeping, categorization, and the preservation of texts survived in the scribal cultures of later civilizations. The habit of archiving and organizing information influenced the bureaucracies of Persia, Greece, and Rome. When modern scholars began to decipher cuneiform in the 19th century, they uncovered a treasure trove of knowledge, including creation myths, legal codes, medical texts, astronomical observations, and epic poetry. One of the most celebrated literary legacies of Mesopotamia is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This poem, composed and refined over centuries, recounts the journey of a Sumerian king who confronts mortality, loss, and the search for meaning. Its themes, human friendship, the fear of death, and the limits of power, are universal and continue to resonate. Elements of the epic, such as the flood narrative, appear in later religious and literary traditions, including the Hebrew Bible and classical mythology. Law was another arena in which Mesopotamia set precedents that would endure. The legal codes of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi established written law as a central institution of governance. These codes outlined rules for commerce, family life, property, and justice. While the penalties were often harsh and shaped by the values of their time, the underlying principle that laws should be written, consistent, and enforced by recognized authorities remains foundational in modern legal systems. In science and mathematics, Mesopotamian scholars made impressive strides. They developed a base 60 numerical system, which remains with us in the way we measure time and angles. Their astronomical records were meticulous, and though often tied to divination and ritual, they laid the groundwork for more systematic astronomy in later eras. The idea that celestial bodies moved in predictable patterns was passed on to Hellenistic and Islamic scientists, eventually influencing the scientific revolution in Europe. Mesopotamian advances in urban planning, irrigation, and architecture also left their mark. The layout of cities like Ur, Nippur, and Babylon, with their temples, canals, walls, and administrative quarters, influenced how later cities were organized. The use of standardized bricks, the construction of ziggurats, and the engineering of large-scale water management systems were achievements studied and admired by neighboring cultures. Religion in Mesopotamia was complex and deeply embedded in society. The pantheon of gods, Anu, Enlil, Marduk, Inanna, Ishtar, and many others, reflected the values, fears, and aspirations of ancient people. While the specific names and rituals faded, Many of the underlying themes continued in later religious systems: divine kingship, the importance of temples, the idea of divine justice, and the use of prayer, offerings, and festivals to connect the human and divine. Several elements of Mesopotamian cosmology and myth found echoes in later texts. The Mesopotamian flood story, as recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh and other texts, predates and resembles the biblical account of Noah. Concepts of divine judgment, paradise, the afterlife, and sacred law were passed on, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, through the Hebrew Bible and into Western religious traditions. Mesopotamian diplomacy and imperial governance also had lasting effects. The idea of a centralized state with provincial governors, regular taxation, official correspondence, and royal decrees was refined by Assyria and Babylon and adopted by the Achaemenid Persians. Persian satraps, for instance, carried forward many of the administrative practices developed in earlier Mesopotamian states. The symbolic role of kingship, where rulers portrayed themselves as chosen by the gods, charged with maintaining order, building temples, and protecting justice, was inherited by many later monarchies. Kings in Egypt, Persia, and even Europe would claim divine or semi-divine status, echoing the traditions of Sumer and Akkad. Even the visual vocabulary of empire, lion hunts, processional reliefs, and monumental inscriptions began in Mesopotamia and was transmitted across centuries. When Alexander the Great entered Babylon, he walked in the shadow of these ancient models. When Roman emperors minted coins showing their triumphs, they unknowingly replicated motifs first carved on Assyrian palace walls. Mesopotamia's intellectual culture, particularly its scribal tradition, also found new life in other civilizations. Hellenistic scholars in cities like Alexandria drew on Babylonian astronomical and mathematical texts. Islamic scholars in Baghdad translated and preserved many works of earlier Mesopotamian science, incorporating them into a broader framework of learning that would later influence medieval Europe. Yet, for all its achievements, Mesopotamian civilization also teaches cautionary lessons. Its empires often rose through conquest and collapsed under the weight of their own ambitions. Its environmental practices, particularly irrigation, contributed to soil salinization and long-term agricultural challenges. Its rigid social hierarchies and dependence on forced labor reflect enduring problems that societies continue to grapple with. By the end of the first millennium BCE, cuneiform had fallen out of use. Aramaic, Greek, and Latin became the dominant languages of administration and culture. Temples fell into disuse, ziggurats crumbled, and once great cities were buried by time. For centuries, Mesopotamia was remembered more through legend than through fact. But in the modern era, the rediscovery of Mesopotamia has reignited interest in its history. Excavations at sites like Nineveh, Ur, and Babylon have brought thousands of texts and artifacts to light. The decipherment of cuneiform has opened a window into ancient minds, revealing a civilization rich in imagination, structure, and complexity. Museums around the world now hold collections of Mesopotamian art, tablets, and architecture. Scholars continue to publish new translations of texts that add nuance to our understanding of ancient life. And educators, filmmakers, writers, and artists draw on the stories and achievements of this civilization to inspire new generations. Mesopotamia was not merely the cradle of civilization in a geographical sense. It was a cradle of ideas about how humans should live together, how power should be organized, how the divine and mortal should interact, and how knowledge could be preserved and passed on. Its innovations in writing, law, religion, administration, and science continue to shape our world in ways most people do not realize. As we conclude this journey through the history of Mesopotamia, we return to the rivers that sustained it, the Tigris and Euphrates. Along their banks, people built cities, dreamed of gods, studied the stars, and left behind a record of human striving that endures long after their empires have fallen. The story of Mesopotamia is not just the story of the past. It is a mirror to the present, and a reminder of how deep the roots of our civilization truly go.